record. Recording.
Don't rely on my recording.
Are you recording?
I am, but don't rely on my recording. This computer is not very reliable.
Oh no, all good. I have mine. And like I said, I'll share the final one and this can get edited. So it's all good. So yeah, let's do this. Why don't we start? I actually wanted to give a bit of a story of how we met.
All right.
If I remember it accurately. Because maybe this actually relates to our, what does your mug say?
It says total bell end.
Okay. Explain.
Bell end is British for dickhead, but nobody here knows that, so this mug is hilarious.
Because if they knew it, it would ruin the joke.
There's more to everything.
Right? Yeah. We met 10 years ago. And I like the story because I think it does relate to this conversation that we're about to have. In that it talks about being open to all connection in a sense. I think because we met in, what was it, the grocery store lineup at like 2 o'clock in the morning at that, what is that market even called?
Well, actually, we technically met in the former Rochdale College because that was G's Fine Foods, which is on the first floor of what originally was a hippie, free love, crazy chaos experiment in the 70s.
Oh, that's even better for the conversation. All right, didn't know that. I just knew I was like getting a hummus wrap at 2 o'clock in the morning after work.
It was after hours.
And if I remember correctly, right, there was a big lineup-ish, and people were complaining that it was taking so long. And I think I made a comment to you, you were in front of me, about like, really, we're here getting groceries at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, why are we complaining that there's like 4 people in line and it's taking a bit of time for the one cashier to help us? And then somehow that segued to us talking about what I was studying, which I was first year. Sorry?
I was holding a book, I think about, is it about Wittgenstein?
Probably.
I remember that's how you knew that I was studying philosophy.
Oh, see, apparently I knew more than I realized I knew. And I remember, the part that I remember the most vividly is when I told you I was studying like linguistics, philosophy, English, whatever, and you did your little sales pitch of, oh, have you heard of the interdisciplinary study of cognitive science? It includes da-da-da-da-da.
These days I'm pitching anarchism instead. Anyway, go on.
There you go. Yeah, and then we became friends. And I became a resident of CASA, and we held it down on weekends when we probably weren't supposed to. And
politically we were supposed to.
It was great. Yeah. I always worried that there were people in that building though that like knew I was there and I didn't know they were there, and it creeped me out at night. And yeah.
Well, that's probably the caretakers. They probably knew we were there.
They might have just pled ignorance because they probably weren't supposed to allow us to stay there. But
well, no, they weren't supposed to generally kick people out of offices.
Okay, so we were okay, maybe.
I think technically we were okay.
Yeah, I mean, we made it through. It's all good.
What's important is that otherwise everyone would have been studying alone, late, because all the students are up late at night anyway, right? Because I made this argument many times when I wanted the office to have more of an open policy. I mean, this would lead naturally into like free migration and anarchism and so on, you know. Because otherwise you have students up late, alone, isolated, studying, stressed as fuck, taking the wrong drugs that the university gives them. And, you know, it's university is so bad for people's mental health. The idea that there's nowhere for people to communally gather past a certain hour is just really destructive. And it's also diurnal. It's just like, well, clearly everybody's on the 9 to 5 and clearly everybody did their readings 2 weeks ago. And of course, nobody's pulling any all-nighters or like losing their freaking mind. Yeah. And like, this is
and it did help.
Socially organize, even just emotional support, you know, in such a stressful environment as U of T. Oh my God.
And I know for me, it was really important because at that time, especially, I wasn't feeling very comfortable in my home environment. Mind you, I was dealing with a lot of personal stuff that definitely fed into that. It wasn't really other people, it was me. But I was trying to process that. I was ill-equipped to do so. I was isolating on my own. So having a space where I felt that I could go and, like you're saying, like have that sense of community and support was really important. And your diligent schedule of 20 minutes focus, 5 minutes rest was also integral to me focusing for 36 hours straight and passing while working full time. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I used that schedule in a less platonic situation around the same time, but it was less effective.
I honestly, like in the past couple years, I did some exams for my full-time gig and I use the tomato timer and I recommend it to
Pomodoro, yeah.
everyone. And it
Yeah, Google,
helps so much.
yeah, typically Google the Pomodoro technique.
Hmm.
Yeah, I actually fiddled around trying to make software to generalize the
I
Pomodoro
remember
method.
that.
Yeah, well,
Well, I
that's a
think
different
that's what you were
topic.
trying out at that time.
That makes a lot of sense.
When I tell people that my friend developed the software on his own that we were using, that's when I tend to lose them. And they're like, no. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Developing our own software is part of what like questioning the default script is, and um, some construals of relationship anarchy are about like rolling your own relationship in terms of you write the rules, which means you're writing your own software. And I happen to think politically, I mean, like like sex and romance aside, I think that like political change is about us all collectively writing our own software because like our society is running software that's kind of fucked up, like the economic system, political system. But yeah, I get that other thing. Anyway,
It all goes full circle, dude. I love that.
I
It's
hope
always
so.
like I plan these talks and we start rambling, and then someone just creates this perfect segue back to the topic. And like you might have done that intentionally, knowing you there was some intention to that. But at the same time, it is also interconnected. And I think that's really important to recognize because it's where these topics will come up in all the facets of our lives in different ways. And we can be
Yeah,
aware of that and grow from that and
yeah.
whatever.
It's all
And
connected, man.
I think before our topic conversation, you posted asking people questions. I posted some things to my Instagram stories, and I want to focus on the specific today. What were we talking about? Like let monogamy come from introversion, never from,
Never from control. Yeah, so
yeah.
introversion versus control,
So
basically.
with that, I mean,
Because you
I
can
think we're
make someone
gonna,
introverted.
mhm, that's true. And I think we're gonna focus on that, but I would like, if you can, to give like a little 30-second definition kind of spiel on like what is relationship anarchy as kind of a, creating a bit of context for the
Right.
conversation, that we might dive into that more explicitly on a different day.
Right. So you're probably familiar with skepticism generally, philosophical skepticism, questioning knowledge, and just generally questioning things. And we all grew up questioning things at some point, especially as teenagers. That's maybe sort of the script you internalize through
Yeah, my
generations.
parents hated it.
Skeptical. Well, they might have hated it more if you just believed everything they said, including all their mistakes, and fed them back to them. They'd be like, "Oh God, you're doing what I did."
Right? Yeah, at least I've grown and developed from there. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Right, and that's part of the
Yeah.
natural process.
Yeah.
And you could imagine maybe someone saying, well, you need to back up a little. So anarchism, you can think of as applying that skepticism, questioning specifically to power, being skeptical of power, of domination, of submission. That does lead naturally to skepticism of BDSM, which is why you have to, when you're looking at anarchism and sexuality, you have to ask how far do you go before it becomes kink shaming. If you're questioning power, and some people are like, well, our kink is power play. Therefore you're kink shaming us by being so questioning of the fetishization of power. Well, okay, but the way I view it is a process, the process of asking those questions, and sometimes you get good answers. And relationship anarchy is just applying it specifically to relationships, like actually we just did in the case of comparing it to relating it to BDSM. And so if it's all about questioning power or questioning power difference, it's just a question of which kind of power difference are you questioning. You could question gender-based power differences, which is like feminism. You can question racial power differences, which is like anti-racism. You can question class-based power differences. And in human relationships, you can question power difference between people in a relationship, like is this relationship controlling, between two other people that one person is related to, like it could be their children, they play favorites with their children or their students, or it could be sexual partners. And you could question, why does one sexual partner in this person's life have more power over them? Should they? Is that justified? Is that okay? When is it okay for someone to have more power than someone else over someone? Also you can question power between types of relationships, because some might be like, oh well, like I'm your best friend, they're just your romantic partner, therefore I should get priority. Or the romantic partner might make the same argument. They might say, well, they're just your friend, I'm your romantic partner, therefore I should get priority for the picnic or whatever. Yeah, whatever the schedule conflict or
The
whatever
picnic. Yeah.
whatever the scarcity, artificial or otherwise, is.
Mm-hmm.
Although well, we'll probably talk about artificial scarcity later, but that's the rough idea of the definition of anarchism. And full citation, I get this view of anarchism roughly from Chomsky, because he describes it as a tendency in human thought. But I don't call myself a Chomskyan anarchist, because that doesn't make, nobody knows what that means. I like I mean, they pushed me for a label on the Multiversity Project show, and so I decided to identify as an anarcho-pacifist. That's clear enough, because a lot of people hear anarchism and they think, oh, you want violence. It's like nothing could be further from the truth. I do want peaceful revolution, but that's another story. I think that might prevent violence.
You don't have to have a label here.
Well, that might clarify things at any rate.
That's fair. Yeah, but no, don't feel forced. I think so. Thank you for that one, because I definitely could not explain it that well at all. The area that I've been exploring a bit more, and I think the area that comes up a lot for the people that I work with, and this is what I actually posted about before our chat to my Instagram stories with some of these questions, be like, who knows what, and what are you feeling, what are you thinking?
I missed it on Instagram.
Oh, that's fine. I tagged you, but whatever.
Oh,
it's all good. So
what,
right? Get with the gram, yo. So it was about specifically purity culture and the dynamic that sometimes pushes or constructs on romantic partnership. And I do believe a lot of the people that I end up talking to in the work that I'm doing, and even for myself, it's been a big thing I'm unpacking, is realizing where are these rules or parameters that we ascribe to or set for ourselves and our partner, and that maybe goes into the control bit.
Relationships.
Where are those coming from, purity culture specifically, versus where is it a narrative that actually continues to serve us now? And I think that goes into the part you're talking about in questioning and trying to understand in a different way, and that skepticism aspect. And something I always share as I'm going through this with people, because not everyone's going to end on the same viewpoints, and that's okay too. I know for myself, there's an ideal and there's how I'm living, and they are not currently the same. And I'm aware, and I, work through that and bridge the gap where I can, and blah, blah, blah. And so it's realizing too that in questioning that narrative we grew up with, that purity culture narrative, that no sex before marriage, that, this is good and this is bad. Some of those things might still continue to serve you depending where you're at. And so it's not to say you have to get rid of them. It's just what tools can we use to start to question them and be okay with questioning them and go from there. And then if they change, how can we kind of be okay with integrating that, and what does that look like, and onward from there? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind there. I mean, one is that, like sometimes with children, you give them rules before they can understand the explanation, right? And so something like, it sounds like you were talking about, in a second, you should say more about purity culture as a concept, but it sounds like you were talking about it as being kind of rule-based. And so I sort of made the connection in my mind to actually something I posted in that thread, I guess we could link to the description of this, about rule-based relationships. And there's something about rules that are inherently controlling, you might say. I mean, not the descriptive rules of like, here's how we think well, my partner tends to behave this way or something like that. These are the rules I tend to follow. But like prescriptive rules, like prescriptions are controlling. So just in terms of tendencies, it doesn't help if people already have controlling tendencies and you put them in a situation where it's like, now you're about to apply rules to your partner. It's like, oh, okay. Some people are just waiting for that moment. Oh, now I get to be in charge, and it's like, anyway. But yeah, say more about, because I was going to say, you should say more about purity culture, because I imagine the connection is really obvious, I guess, between purity culture and something like slut shaming. And obviously that's connected to the promiscuity side of polyamory. But of course, people can be relationship anarchists without having any sex at all. You just have to question power differences. It's not about, having the sex might be part of how you question power differences in some cases, but like, you can phrase the same question differently, so to speak. And the same is true of let's say, either polyamory or accidental monogamy, where like people just are introverted, so they don't happen to go out and meet as many people or whatever, but nobody's making that happen. It's just their own natural inclinations, unrepressed, expressing themselves naturally. Yeah, but anyway, so do you see purity culture's connection to this primarily where it touches upon sexuality and slut shaming, or you see it more generally like people being too rigid is part of purity culture essentially, or something like that?
Well, I think, of course, it would depend on the specific person and their upbringing, etc. But generally, my view is that it really does come into play on all fronts. And so the really basic version that comes up a lot, and I bring this up a lot when I'm talking about sort of anxious attachment style and how to work through that, is that notion that, sorry?
I said, you got to help me there.
Oh, well, I can send you some videos, my friend, but no, is the notion that my partner needs to be my everything and anything. And I feel like a lot of it, and even when you were talking about those rules, I feel like the rules that we do put on a relationship, maybe from a place of control, often a place of a fear of some sort that comes up as control, are or can be tied to that sort of a high school version of romance. For myself, when I really unpack it, it does go back to that purity culture upbringing where
what was the high school version?
The high school version where where your partner is your everything and anything.
High school.
You're right. And so it's like, well, what you were talking about, where some people go into romantic partnership and now you're with this one person and they are now the only guest at that picnic that you were referencing earlier, right? It's like, well, best friend, you're on the back burner because I have this person now and I need to show up for them and show them why I'm awesome and nurture this relationship as much as possible because it's the one that's going to take me through the rest of my life and yada, yada, yada. And so I feel like,
probably
for
won't.
me at least, purity, yeah, well, there's that. Purity culture, that upbringing and that narrative that I was taught about romantic partnership, even outside of, you have sex with this one person to create a baby because you love them, was really, this is the one relationship my life will be centered around, and needing to put everything into that. And it was almost like that relationship was the goal, was to have that one person, to have all these things, and my story would be written and secure, so which is yes.
Presumably that, sure. And presumably that one relationship, of course, in that narrative is actually supposed to be subordinate to the parent-child relationship that it gives birth to, literally.
Yeah, that too. And that, I think, is a whole other
But
once you have, I could talk about a lot. Yeah.
But if that relationship goes, in a sense, so well that you have multiple children, I mean, if that's the whole idea, that's what means the relationship is going well, then you're going to have multiple children, and then you're going to face a lot of the same issues that you would have faced in the case of poly romance, in the case of dividing your parental love and your attention and other, mental, emotional resources among your children.
Absolutely.
So I see it as actually a deferral of the cognitive complexity that we need people to have in their social relationships anyway. Like if you're going to have a big family, it's the same as having, well, not the same, but it involves a lot of the same skills as having a complicated social network of any kind. It's lots of people, lots of thoughts, lots of perspectives, which is what we need to consider politically. We need to be more, and actually, I think you'll like this angle. This is a bit more philosophical, because I think that being more considerate actually makes us freer. And at least the angle I'm thinking, this is all about freedom. And if you could say this other thing is free will, in which case the concept becomes useless for, say, like distinguishing an abusive relationship, where presumably you have less freedom of some kind. Maybe it's not free will per se, but it's less freedom, something like that, in the more abusive relationship. And I think that so that's freedom in general, so to speak, but I think it's tied to considerateness in the sense that if you only consider the perspective of the person who's controlling you, then you're not very free. But if you consider, say, your partner's, suppose you're in a monogamous relationship, so you consider your partner's perspective and your best friend's perspective, well, then in a sense, you might be more free, because you might be free to escape, say, an abusive partner when your best friend says, like, you realize they're mistreating you, and, like, here's a contrast. My relationship's not like that. Of course, when somebody's actually dating two people, they can see that contrast themselves sometimes, when it's like, well, this one partner is treating me like this, but my other relationship's not like that. And it can be hard to remember when you're like the frog in the pot of boiling water in an abusive relationship, and you're like, oh, this has become normal over time. Maybe a bit of a digression, but anyway.
No, I think that's really important. And I think the other part that I'm glad you sort of alluded to, so I'm going to highlight a little bit more, is that speaking about relationship anarchy and these other little intricacies that we're getting into in this conversation doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be in a poly sort of relationship dynamic or situation. I don't know what words you would want to use.
I would say
to explore that.
Use the word promiscuous, because because I think it's possible to be poly without being promiscuous at all. Someone could be poly and completely celibate in the sense that they don't consent to monogamy.
That makes sense.
They have not consented to they haven't signed an exclusive contract.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're polyamorous, even if they're completely celibate. They might not even have a dick, but they didn't sign the contract. So in that sense, they're polyamorous.
Okay. So I guess we can explore these topics.
We're going to belabor the example.
In the context of a monogamous partnership as well. because we can still question those constructs or the societal norms or the rules that are kind of more implicit and go from there. And I know that's been a big one that people ask me about a lot, especially being in a long distance relationship, because it's been this way for 4 years. Mind you, right now he's in the other room, but we spend a lot of time apart. We have different, yeah, he's locked up with the cat. And we have different friend groups. We don't spend time together during the week. We do not have daily phone calls. There's a lot of things about our partnership that I probably need to expand on another day, that when people find out about it or they hear that that's our norm, they kind of jump back a little bit. They're surprised that we don't almost compensate in a sense for not being together all the time in these other ways. And I think that is a way of, not that we're 100% perfect all the time with questioning, and that's where you're allowed to call me on some stuff in this conversation, because I think that's part of what we're exploring. But that's where we have started to question that and realize, it doesn't really work for us to talk every single night. Lately, a bit more with the wedding planning, but usually it was a couple texts a day and maybe one conversation a week. And that was sufficient. And when we first started dating, I made it very explicit that I would be making time for friends who I'd been hanging out with regularly, and that needed to stay in place. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice that as we move forward in this relationship.
An example that this is an example where, like if people from opposite ends agree, you might be safe on the truth of something. And, I'm an extreme anarchist, and you're probably familiar with the idea that Peterson's pretty pro-monogamy. And his claim is that a married couple needs to see each other and have a real conversation for, I think he said something like an hour a week or 40 minutes a week. I think he said 40 minutes. It sounds really like I need those extra 20 minutes to like run my lab or something. But with people who are really sort of type A with their careers, like never mind sexual promiscuity, it's like they couldn't possibly spend that much time like talking to their partners or they're raising a child. It's like maybe they spend that much time with their child, or maybe they'll pay for childcare if they're making money with their career that's taking all their time, something like that. And so even someone who doesn't even believe at all really in polyamory can turn around and say, oh yeah, you need to talk to your wife for like 40 minutes a week just to make sure you're on the same page. And like, oh, mind you, that's like, a middle-aged man saying that. It's not the same when you're 14,
Yeah, and I think the big difference for us was if you flip it to the opposite end of the spectrum. I know couples, for example, where they live together, and if they're apart for a week, they need to talk on the phone every single day for those 40 minutes. Whereas I think the last time I saw you was when I was in Ontario for work, and I was out there for 5 weeks, and my partner and I reverted to our weekly phone calls. The time difference also made that challenging. And so some weeks that didn't happen. And I will say, if we're going on the topic of Peterson and that 40 minutes a week thing, we felt it on those weeks where we didn't have that minimum 40 minutes to talk. But did we need more than that? No. And part of the reason was because I was hanging out with you. I was hanging out with other friends, and I was being very social during the day. I had a social job. And so some nights when I came home, I needed to just be alone. And talking to that partner wouldn't have nurtured me in the way that I needed at that time.
Well, yeah, and speaking of, the status we were mentioning earlier is maybe kind of coming down hard on introversion, but this is a great example of the merits of introversion, because people do need that time alone to have that contrasting perspective, because as much as we need extroversion so people form communities and talk to each other and collective action and all that, you also need introspection and alone time to avoid groupthink. And, I certainly did a lot of introspection on my own time about how I thought people should relate in groups, and also talking to people. I mean, and that's a very natural thing. And so keeping everybody constantly in need of that attention from a primary relationship all the time, partly by having that be the social norm, that if you're not getting that, there's something wrong. I mean, it's kind of distracting. It leaves less time over to question other things, and I do think that sometimes the way our society approaches romance is politically disabling. It can be distracting. It can be that, it breeds toxicity in one way or another, or that we don't form very large social groups that are actually politically cohesive, where like people could work out their ideas and like reach a conclusion and then, act together in our culture, if they agree. about something.
Yeah, and I noticed that. So that's pulling this topic a little bit of a different direction. But two things from that. Two things.
Sure.
One, I noticed that for myself because a lot of my social interaction lately has been like this, or it's in a virtual space, so online, and I am participating in or engaging in, I guess, a market that is saturated with people like me or coaching on things similar to me, and so I noticed very quickly where I get out of that collaborative learning mind and go into competition. And I need to check myself because I'm
Scarcity
not.
mindset.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that what people would often call like imposter syndrome. And sometimes it's just generally frustration with the fact that people are teaching the type of relationship that you and I are kind of questioning. And that I actually I feel for people and then I get angry and I need to step back because I want people to experience that freedom you're talking about in whatever way they're capable of in the moment. And when I see
people are afraid of freedom, that's part of what keeps us unfree, right? Like it's a lot of responsibility to have like carte blanche and okay, now it's up to you to decide from all of the possibilities what your relationship should be like. It is a lot of pressure to have freedom.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's our job. It's just not. I think everybody needs to take just as much responsibility as they can, and not anymore, because otherwise they're gonna overpromise and underdeliver. And so it's the same with any kind of suppose let's take an example of literal political organizing. It's just some particular movement, you're organizing a big protest or a series, and you know people and get everyone on board and so on. And so people in the movement have to talk to other people. And it's how many conversations are you going to have in a day? How long are they going to be? How much emotional energy? Everybody's got limits. But if nobody pushes their limits, then we don't grow. And like I was mentioning, that thread that sort of this springboard a bit off of, I personally, I pushed my introversion over the years. I used to be on the big five more introverted, and I worked at it, and maybe I was naturally introverted and there were things getting extroverted and there were things getting in the way, or maybe I was naturally introverted and I developed it like a skill. But it's a lot of things are like that. Just someone who's high up in a family, like a parent is going to develop that skill over time. They're going to fuck up more with their first child and so on. And just you probably mess up.
Is that what I'm the result of? Thanks. No kidding.
Well, I'm an only child, so I guess I'm wrong and right.
Did they need more, or they stopped because they needed less practice? Kidding. No, that's interesting. I feel like I was about to mention something and I went totally blank. Sorry, because then I laughed because I'm the eldest child and I was like, how much did this mess me up? No, I'm kidding. My parents are awesome. But that goes back to what we were talking about earlier too. The flip side of that, and so one, actually talking about control, I think, and this might segue into my next point, is I find often the conversation around boundaries and setting one's boundaries and communicating one's boundaries is really a front for being controlling. That could have worded that better in a relationship.
Glad to hear you say it.
And I think the thing is and I always say, just because I set a boundary doesn't mean someone else is going to respect it. And so for me, part of when I coach on setting boundaries is, being okay with at what point do I decide I walk away, regardless of what the situation is,
and that set the boundary.
So yeah, the level of walking away might be, just going to the other room and being like, okay, you figure this out on your end, I'm out. It could be fully walking away from a relationship because that boundary's been tested one too many times. It could also be a much more firm boundary where I decide up front, maybe this is more on the explicit topic of consent in a sexual situation. And if that boundary is not respected, I'm done. I don't let it be pushed, depending on the circumstance. You can play with that in different ways on the level of comfort and whatever. And then that goes into what I was going to mention, because I said I'm okay with you coaching me in this conversation, is a conversation Hunter and I had about moving in together, because he knows I need time by myself. And I made this very clear. And there are weekends where we plan to be apart and he might want to come visit, and I've already made some other plans. And for me, the level of social engagement that I already have in my planner is too much. And so I know I need that weekend fully alone.
Yeah.
For him, alone can be well, like right now he's in the other room. His argument would be, well, you're alone right now.
Uh,
For me, alone is, no, I'm the only human in the vicinity.
yeah, that's
And
a
so
lot.
I've said,
Someone can
and
observe you or hear your breathing. It's not the same, you know.
I hope you can't hear me breathing from the next room, but I guess it depends how congested I
Breathe more
am.
deeply.
Yeah, so um,
The vault.
it's different for both of us, right? Like he would be okay with having me in the next room. For me, that is not solitude. And I made it very clear that once we're married and living together, I'm gonna need to go to a hotel some weekends or an Airbnb by
Or he's
myself,
going to need to. You see,
or he'll need to.
this is one of the advantages of polyamory. If he was out for the weekend, you have a place to yourself. If he was
Yeah,
staying
I'm just
place.
gonna go get myself a bougie hotel, and he can stay here and clean. But I'm kidding. Half kidding.
It's kind of a
Yeah.
mundane argument, but you know, it is one of the upsides of when your partner has other stuff to do, whether it's a person or a project. You know, it's like if it involves them leaving the house, then someone gets more space, and that can be a plus for a relationship, regardless of the promiscuity level.
Well, and I think if we're, going back, because obviously, like, I'm not in that type of relationship at this point in time. But and that's where I love reading and learning about promiscuity, polyamory, because those principles can still be applied in a monogamous situation and are very valuable. And so in this instance, it's realizing, like you can go do things with your friends and I can go have this weekend by myself. And that's not wrong. Like that's not problematic. Yeah. It's actually needed so that I can show up better for this relationship on the Monday afterwards, right? But he did not like this. This is what brings us to the scarcity and controlling.
Okay.
For him, it came up as a personal thing. Like he wasn't enough because I wanted to go, and it was a problem that I couldn't be satisfied being at home in separate rooms and feel that I was alone. And so that was a really important conversation for us to have. But I feel like that goes back to our initial topic a bit. And so without being hard on him, because it was a growing opportunity for both of us, we could kind of unpack it from there.
I've been in your situation in this conversation before. Yeah. Well, okay, I was going to say, what do you want to unpack? But I also want to say before I forget, because you were saying, here's where I can coach you. I think we should go back to maybe where you can coach me. I mean, I was just curious about something you said, to say the least, because you said something like about a boundary being tested one too many times. Mm-hmm. And I immediately thought, well, isn't testing a boundary once one too many times? Because because when you're a child and you don't understand language, then you have to test boundaries to learn the meaning of words. But once you can talk, aren't you just supposed to fucking listen to what they say and not test someone's boundaries at all? Right? Because that's why we have words.
Make a bumper sticker or something like that.
There's no testing. It's not testing. It's just listening. Like if someone says, "Don't touch me," there's no test involved. If someone says, like, "I want to be alone for a week," it means they want to be alone for a week. That's it. There's no. You don't have to test it. You just do it. Yeah. Now you have to test it if it's ambiguous. If someone doesn't communicate clearly, but if they're like very specific, like don't call me after 12 p.m. Then you don't call after 12 p.m. You don't do it to see how angry they get, to see if they really mean it. But people do this as grown adults, which is what like a 5-year-old does, right? Because they're like, oh, do they really mean it? It's like, how would you assume sincerity if that's what you want anyway? And if they don't mean it, they'll learn to say what they really mean next time. If somebody says like, leave me alone, and you leave them alone, and they didn't want that, maybe next time they won't say it, if it turns out. But at least they've learned that their words have power to give them space. And, whatever it is, like in exposure therapy, it first seems paradoxical because it's like, why is the treatment the same as the cure? Like, you're afraid of snakes, we're exposing you to snakes, but snakes are what made you afraid of snakes. So like, how are snakes gonna undo what they did? But the difference is that it's voluntary, that you have control over it. It can be helpful.
My roommates did that to me before because I wasn't comfortable. Yeah, they told me they were going to do it. I wasn't comfortable with PDA.
Backwards. And it's funny. Yeah, I did tell somebody that they needed exposure therapy for PDA recently.
Yeah, they did it to me, and I
other partner
was like, "This is highly inappropriate." But
anyway. Well, yeah. I mean, I would. It's different if it's something that, like I could say, I'm uncomfortable with people forming protests down the street from my house, but like I shouldn't stop them. Yeah, it's freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and all that. But if their goal was to actually change how you felt, as opposed to just to assert their own freedom, to make, like, because I can see somebody doing that, because I can see somebody saying, "Oh, fuck you! I'm about to kiss somebody in front of you if you're against PDA. Fuck you." Especially if they're like, if it's like they're used to homophobia or something like that, and they're like, "Fuck you, we love each other," and that is about asserting their freedom from other people. But if they were instead functioning like as your therapist, which they're not obligated to, but if they were, they would say, okay, for you, you need to experience this voluntarily. You need to like tell us in your schedule when you want to see us make out, and then you'll be in control of it at
5
first,
o'clock,
and
please.
you'll feel more comfortable if
Yeah.
it's something that you're choosing and have some control over.
I could have just watched porn. Just kidding.
That with exposure therapy, they do start with like showing someone a picture of a snake or something like that. Well, yeah, if you can't like look, I think there's a lot of toxic about porn, but if you like can't see it, there's probably something wrong with you. Like if there's no porn that you can see, just like, no, I am seeing porn. It's like you need to relax.
On that note, I recommend Erica
obviously
Lust.
when you're in control of it. Obviously you don't want somebody just like showing you porn when you're not in the mood to see porn. It goes without saying, you'd think, although people do strange things.
Yeah, and that, I mean, this is where I said we would find all these other conversations that we could have at some point in time. I'm not someone who enjoys it. It has been important for me, like you're mentioning, to become okay with watching it in certain contexts, or just generally okay. And so for me, it was very helpful to follow some people on Instagram who make videos that I can watch from a more educational perspective about like testing societal norms and that sort of thing. And I could engage in it in a different way than the way that I thought was expected of me. Yeah. So that was good. Anyway, boundaries.
So surely you shouldn't test them at all once you understand English.
I just like, yes.
Right?
Agreed. I think
like that's, I mean, assuming it's a personal boundary, like a personal boundary is what you justify basically.
So let's reword it maybe. So there are times when I have set a boundary and it is not respected by my partner. It doesn't, and this is what I see a lot of online is people saying, if they don't respect your boundaries, stand in your worth and walk away.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes
no, I agree
really
with
depends
you.
what boundary yeah.
Exactly. And that is where, for me, it comes back to my core values and how I decide to navigate that situation. Because depending on the type of boundary and when I made it and with whom I've made it, I hope I said that right, I might be okay wavering to an extent, or with having it not be respected once and re-articulating it and seeing what happens. And, it can depend on my investment in the relationship, what the boundary is around, what boundary is not being respected, whatever. So my example that I did share about openly a little bit ago was like last weekend, I had to go pick out charger plates for our wedding. And I had asked Hunter, can you be available in this 1 hour window specifically? Because I was going to the store and I needed real-time responses on what I was shopping for. And he said yes. Well, he ended up going out of the house and going to a friend's house. So he was not responsive during that time. And so that is an example where I did communicate clearly my expectation. He opted in. And so we had that conversation, and then that was not respected. So to me, that's how I would say like my boundary was not respected.
Oh. Well, it seems less, I mean, maybe you can stretch the terms. I thought when you said expectation, it made a bit more sense. Because like, I guess I think of boundaries in the negative instead of like what you're, I mean, you can put a boundary on what you're not doing, like don't not do these things, but like it gets a little confusing. That's, we could say boundaries and expectations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Terminology you're using,
So I guess with that though, that is an example where my time was not respected.
Sure.
He, in my mind, acted inconsistent with what he had said and consented to and opted into. Now, in this instance, I'm not going to fully walk away from my engagement because he derped for an hour and disrespected me. Yes, I was angry.
No matter what that meme tells you to do. Yeah, don't let that meme control you.
Yeah, and there was definitely a me coming back saying, no, I am not being dramatic. You're being an asshole. Let's talk this out. But I'm not going to fully walk away from my relationship because of it. And that's where, that's the wonderful thing about relationships. I sound like, is that like Tigger? I'm like all bouncy. Is that I think once we are, and they can change over time, but once we're more grounded in like what are our core values and our core needs or boundaries is how I would word that, expectations, realistic expectations, we'll say maybe, in a relationship, we can use those to determine when we're okay with, okay, let's try this again. And when it's more of a hard no and I'm walking away. And that doesn't look the same for everyone, and it might not look the same day to day.
Okay,
and that's fine.
But in that case, I wouldn't say that he was testing your boundaries.
That's fair.
So maybe we need a different example. not that you're expected to provide personal examples for every concept. Okay,
Yeah,
Natalie, let's mind your life again for example. Spill it all. But you see what I mean? That I mean more so when you tell somebody not to do.
Oh, I have one. I hate being tickled.
Because positive obligations, it could be like maybe they're like maybe they're disorganized, they have some problem, maybe like someone is really tired that like things can happen.
Oh, he had problems. I was his problem after that. No, I'm kidding. I think tickling is one. If you want to go more clear cut, like physical boundary, I do not like being tickled. Okay. And I am very clear about it. And like early on in our relationship, he went to tickle me and I was like, do not tickle me, like ever. This is not a thing you are allowed to do.
Right.
And he still did it. And I am still here. He does not do it anymore. Right. But maybe that's a more clear example, like what you're kind of talking about.
Yeah, well, okay, so let me consider that example. So I could imagine myself telling somebody something like that. Maybe it wouldn't be tickling, but I could imagine saying that's a never, and it might be something that seems like that's a normal thing, but you know, everybody's got different rules. And I think if somebody did that, it would depend on why. Like for instance, if someone's fairly young and I think maybe they haven't learned that in general yet, that they don't, like what I was saying earlier, that like testing boundaries is something you're supposed to grow out of, that you're supposed to start listening and stop testing. That's true, you know, and in fact that might generalize relationships as well, because a lot of turbulent things, let's say, that come up in relationships are people testing each other.
Oh yeah.
But a relationship isn't all just about tests. You know, if all you did was test the relationship, you'd never use it for anything. You'd just be spending all your time in the testing phase of development, you know?
And it would probably be very unsettling.
Well, yeah, but people rock the boat in a relationship to test it out of insecure attachment, like you were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's one of the things maybe that, like, who knows, maybe some people test boundaries because they weren't given clear enough boundaries as children. So they're still trying to understand like the reality of it all, but like what are the boundaries actually, like, because maybe when they were young, what people said wasn't consistent with the boundaries that were actually enforced, because, you know, you have to actually teach somebody that people aren't full of shit, basically. That like, no, when someone says that, like, you know, like if you're a parent and you tell your child, you know, daddy's working, you know, don't come in this room for 2 hours, and then they come in the room anyway and you reward them. Yeah. Well, you're just teaching them to disrespect, say, their partner's boundaries in the future. Right. And so if I thought that somebody was in that situation and that's why they weren't respecting my boundaries, I'd be more understanding, because I would understand what's missing in the educational step, like why they haven't grown out of testing boundaries, and why they aren't just respecting them, listening and respecting the boundary without testing it. Now, it would be different if I thought they were doing it malevolently, and I thought like, no, they understand the principle and they think they're above that they're too smart for these normal social rules, or that they gain some pleasure in the fact that it's transgressive. That's a red flag. That's a huge red flag right there. And it doesn't matter what the boundary is. If they're glad that you're upset, you know, it's also an immature thing that, you know, you might expect people are like it when they're a child and they grow out of it. But like when a grown adult is like, ha ha ha, like, I can see you squirm, you're uncomfortable, it satisfies me. It's like, well, you know, where's the relationship going to go from there? You know? Yeah. Now, some people are pretty immature and they find partners who are mature, and this takes them longer to get to that point. And so you might have people who are 25, they're both 25, and they still haven't learned that you don't test each other all the time, or maybe at all in the case of boundaries. You just do it, you know, for personal boundaries, which, like I was saying earlier, is basically by definition, if personal boundaries are the ones that we say you don't justify. Like for instance, in the tickling, no one's like, well, do you have a good enough reason to not want to be tickled? It's like, go fuck yourself. It doesn't matter what my fucking reason is, just don't fucking do it. Like even asking for the reason is the wrong answer, you know?
It's like you listened to our conversation or something. Yeah.
Yeah, like no one is supposed to say to you, oh well, you know, you have to convince me not to tickle you. It's like, go fuck yourself.
Just don't fucking do it.
Do it. And like, you know, maybe they might be like blessed with the reason later if they really want to know it, but like you're not gonna you wouldn't want, if that's something, first of all, if that's what they want is to know the reason, don't give it to them as a reward for not respecting your boundaries, right? If someone's like not respecting your boundaries, the next thing to do is do not give them what they want, because then they're going to be rewarded for not respecting boundaries, you know? And if what they want is an explanation, don't give it to them until they're actually respecting your boundaries, and then maybe you could choose to give an explanation if you want them to understand. Maybe you don't care if that person understands. You know, if you're in a long-term relationship with them, yeah, you do. And also, you know, everyone's in a long-term relationship with society. It is helpful if people understand, because they're going to go off and treat other people the same way they treated you if they don't learn anything. And everyone's teacher, you know, in that way. But yeah.
Absolutely. And my boundary did get not respected, and he found out the reason. And I am still here. However, he does not test that anymore. And I think that does go back to what you're talking about in terms of learning. And I also thought it was really comical because you perfectly averaged our ages without necessarily knowing that he's 23 and I'm 28. So
a bunch of 25. That's the age I started drinking alcohol at.
25?
Yeah.
Wow, I quit at 21. So balance. And it does, I think it does go back. Like, I was someone where my family would set boundaries, or as a kid, rules, and we would test them and they were not enforced consistently. My reaction to that was, in time, to be almost ultra rigid, clear with my boundaries. I'm getting better now when it's okay to be a little bit softer and a bit more fluid. But for a long time, I was one where I was like, okay, you didn't listen to this, you're shut out, like, entirely. And that was how I rebelled, which reminds me, I think, of the story from you where you at first rebelled against your upbringing with a lot of structure and then gradually kind of figured out your way.
One dimension of the story.
I think on Hunter's side, and we've definitely been talking about this, I lost my headphone, a lot with the wedding planning, is he is still figuring out those boundaries and how to articulate them for himself and how to even sometimes enforce them when maybe the other person doesn't know how to communicate them explicitly. And so we're kind of navigating that together right now from almost polar opposite ends of the spectrum, which has been really interesting and also really constructive just for us as a couple or partnership or whatever you want to say, as we move forward into this new part of our journey. But yeah, the tickling one, that was that was a better example. I feel like that helped. Yes.
Yeah, and it's one of these boundaries that maybe a lot of people in the audience can relate to both sides of it, because people are kind of raised with that tickling is some kind of exception, that like it is something that you do even though someone doesn't like it. And it's like, and many people are taught that as a child. They're like, yeah, your boundary's fine, but when the yell tickling you, you don't get to say no or something.
And that was totally what happened to me. So I think there's some trauma there.
And I think that's changing a little bit. Like you do see articles saying like, what children have the right to say they don't want to be tickled, and
yeah, like they have consent over their own body. Interesting.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What's less written is that they have autonomy over their own time and social connections. There's a lot of parents controlling who children can socialize with, and sometimes that even plays out along racist lines or classist lines, or even sexist lines for that matter, like, oh, don't have friends of the opposite sex or something like that, which, like, how good is that going to be for the war between the sexes?
That's how you develop healthy relationships.
Oh geez.
Oh, totally.
Because they do say that if who was saying this, I think it was some of those folks that people see as dubious because they're women who speak slightly anti-feminist. It was probably like Kim Paglia or Bettina Art or something like that. But they were saying like, oh, well, girls who grow up with brothers are a lot more comfortable around men and like have fewer of these issues of like these like sexual miscommunications or something like that. Because
I can say that is false in my life.
Well, I was about to say it's definitely false if you like your brother was abusive to you or something like that, or your parents suppose it wasn't your parents tickling you, it was supposed to like one of your siblings, and the parents just like, ha ha, go ahead, keep doing it, and you're like, wow, no one's protecting me. So it's definitely contrary in that case, because it might be that the whole cycle propagates in that way, and that there's these gender things and the way that what the parents do and don't enforce between children, and that propagates. But I think she meant, in a certain kind of ideal situation, like, when there's like they play together, they roughhouse, there's a sense of like physical contact that's not sexual, and that, and people who grow up with that kind of context have that to draw upon in a way that somebody who had a completely monosexual childhood sort of social experience, for the most part, like say at home, maybe their peer group mostly at school was all people of the same sex, and then there's like, oh, this like strange cult of the people of the other sex that you get to know after puberty or something like that. It leaves people very unprepared to negotiate any kind of gray area, I think. And in my public school, there was a rule against any kind of physical contact between anybody, and it was punishable by immediate expulsion from school. So that wasn't a good environment for anyone to practice negotiating any kind of like gray zone in terms of physical boundaries. I mean, it made a lot of sports technically against the rules, which I guess was fine by me. I wasn't that into sports, but maybe I should have been. In the sense of like physical exercise. I mean, I don't like the zero sum aspect, but like physical exercise and important too, but also the physicality, you know, people alienated from their bodies. And, you know, if it's just completely off the books, then it doesn't even come up as like something the kids need to talk about and negotiate and learn to talk about. You know, it's just like, oh, it just doesn't happen. And if you touch me, you're expelled. It's kind of like the meme you're talking. It's very like, you know, I mean, that was the rule. That was the letter of the law. It wasn't enforced quite that stringently because people wouldn't inform. Like, you know, if I like poked my friend like this, they'd go like, oh, hands on, you're gone. You should be expelled now. You should disappear. But of course, people wouldn't inform because the rule was so extreme.
Yeah.
But also meant that they wouldn't necessarily inform when they should have, because maybe they wanted a lesser punishment. They just wanted someone to talk to this kid rather than expel him.
Right.
You know, and because that could be traumatic, thinking like, oh, I caused them to be expelled or like, you know, disassociated from their peers. You know, it's like the person
that totally happened.
Yeah,
so I think for me, that dynamic you were talking about between brother and sister was actually like flipped almost. Like I was definitely the more dominant one, and
because I'm an only child for reference, if anyone's wondering.
Yeah.
Perspective I bring to this, yeah.
And I have one bio brother and 2 stepbrothers now, but that happened later. So with my bio brother, like I definitely exerted control.
Yeah, I've seen.
And then I think
well,
the other.
You, I mean.
Yeah, well, maybe you've known me like a decade, so it's possible. The other part that I think impacted how I've developed relationships with the like people of the opposite sex is witnessing my parents' relationship, and witnessing in particular what you talked about earlier on in this conversation, where they prioritized us over each other. And so I didn't see how in a romantic partnership people nurtured each other and nurtured that relationship, and what boundaries looked like in terms of making that a priority. And so going forward, I had no fucking clue how to navigate that or how to interact or where those boundaries were, or even like how to start to learn what I was comfortable with. I had no gauge for that whatsoever. But you reminded me of a story from like kindergarten, and this kid in my class kissed me, and I was like, just, oh my God, I was repulsed by it. But I was 5. And so that was my thing, is what you're talking about. I was scared to tell my family because I didn't want to be ostracized for getting this other kid in trouble, because I always felt on the outside, and that goes into some other stuff that I talk about other days. But
it's still not wanting to involve the police in something if you think they're going to be too heavy-handed about it, or maybe even with you, let alone with the perpetrator. Yeah.
Well, it's like not knowing what's going to happen. What if I say something and it doesn't go through, and then he hates me, and so do all these other people because they like him better. And it's, you know, and that's been like an ongoing trend whenever I've been the person to speak up about things. And I think, unfortunately, that is why people and myself get scared to speak up about things, because often the times when I have, it ends up coming back to bite me, not the person who offended in the first place. So anyway, slight segue.
That's very true. I've seen it happen a million times, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's
so,
and like workplace, whatever. Anyway,
so we talked about the boundary thing, which is where I was saying like, why don't you coach me or whatever? But now I forgot the thing that I paused to go back to that.
Cancel me. It was about the story I brought up in reference to the thread on Facebook, which was about introversion versus control. Was the conversation about me saying I need time fully by myself, even once we're married, and him being like, aren't I enough for you? And then us navigating that conversation. But I thought it would be a good way to bring up this topic a little bit more.
Which topic?
The topic of introversion, or in this case, need for solitude versus control, and how that played out in this interaction.
Yeah, because I associate that not with that personal space. I mean, as much as I'm like actually an ambivert or whatever, but like I associate that need for space with actually being extroverted, because like when I see a lot of people in a week, that's when I need the space. You know, like if I haven't seen anybody all week, I'm like, I'll talk to anybody. You know, I've been alone all week, you know, and be like, I'll talk to the squirrels, you know. But like
then no one else will be talking to you. No,
I mean, you know what I mean? Once I get talking, people wonder how I have all the energy, and it's probably because I have to go recharge my batteries.
That's crazy. Well, it's interesting too, because you pointed out like intentionally working on being less introverted, but I have never thought you to be introverted. Like I always saw you as this like social.
But you only saw me when I was
type.
out. I mean, but there's a reason I was up all night in the CAS office with you and other people than studying at home alone in my room.
Fair, yeah. I guess for me, like I saw you as
sorry, that's consistent with what you're saying. Yeah, but you only saw me when
I saw you going in more naturally versus like for me, it felt very forced to put myself in that situation, and it was more comfortable than being at home, but it was still very uncomfortable
Well,
and not
yeah,
natural.
you know, I was older than you. When I was your age, I probably would have felt that force, which is part of why I place so much emphasis on getting people out of their shell,
Yeah.
out of their room, community stuff at school. Because I already went through many years of school doing the complete introvert thing, and then being like, well, this is shit. I should actually, while I'm still here, I should learn the other stuff that's not in the curriculum of like forming a community and like organizing politically and all that stuff and everyone's
I
issues.
was a child, wasn't I? I was 18.
Yeah, well.
Oh my God. I mean, I know I just said a decade, but
when I was
it's
18, I would have been not very social in that context. Yeah.
Well, it was intimidating too intellectually. I mean, there's a lot of very intelligent people in that room, and I was coming in brand new, and I just, yeah, it was a lot. So that's also something.
Knowledgeable people. You weren't any less smart than anybody.
Well, thank you. I did not feel that way. I appreciate that.
Everybody feels like that in university because they're surrounded by things they don't understand.
Fact.
But like most of the people at U of T is like their intelligence is really not the issue. It's like there are things where it's like, oh, if only you could process a little faster, like you'd be better at this or whatever. But like like maybe everybody at U of T is already smart enough and they need to listen better or something. You know, maybe there could be something completely unrelated to like raw speed that is holding somebody back. But people are really obsessed with that one dimension of like getting the better grade or in those sort of academic positions and all that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Anyway, we could do a whole episode on the stress of the academic environment.
Let's
the
do it next
stress
time.
of academia. Okay, because that's something we know personally together.
Yes, very, very well. But yes. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. The many topics at hand, but this one in particular. Yeah. So you were saying that you relate it more to the other thing. I forget what you were saying. You were on a tangent, not me. I'm letting you continue.
Okay. Here's my tangent. I mean, let's go back to this topic of personal boundaries, because suppose someone says like, you have to respect my boundaries, and my boundary is you don't hang out with people of the opposite sex alone. Suppose that's my boundary, but it's a boundary on your behavior when I'm not even there. And you might think, well, how personal is that boundary? Like, it sounds pretty like remove the person. You might say, well, of course it affects someone personally what someone does psychologically, but actually here's a good comparison. I mean, I found this comparison is people seem to find this a good comparison, and that helps them think about this, that like people don't consider it, I do, but most people don't raise an eyebrow if someone says, oh, I don't want my partners to have too many partners. And I mean, people might raise an eyebrow just because someone's using the word partners plural. That's why they raise an eyebrow to that. Or if someone says, I don't want my partner to have another partner, people are like, well, yeah, that's like, of course I relate to that. Like, I've seen 50 million movies about that same desire. Of course I share this desire. It's culturally scripted. It's appropriate. Yeah. But if someone says, I don't want my friends to have too many friends, well, then it's like, what's wrong with you, loser? Like, like, why don't you want how insecure are you that if your friend is popular, you want them to be less popular rather than you want more friends too? Now, there might be a bit of a difference in everyone's degree of fan, like in a network thing, how many nodes you're connected to. Like, some people might need more depth and some people need more breadth, and like that's fair enough. But you don't get what you want by trying to control people. It's the same as respecting other people's boundaries, I think. And people can disagree about which boundaries are personal boundaries without disagreeing that when it is a personal boundary, it requires a justification. I would treat that as kind of definitional and saying, like, if you think it requires justification, you're not treating it as a personal boundary. And to treat something as a personal boundary is that person decides. It's not up to any other person. It's that person's boundary. But if it's something that needs to be negotiated, then it's not a personal boundary, and you don't apply this absolutist script of my way or the highway to something that actually should be negotiated, like how much time you spend together in a relationship. Like for instance, I wouldn't tolerate in any relationship someone telling me you need to have fewer friends. But I would far more than tolerate someone saying, like, I feel like we need to spend more time together for this relationship. I would immediately be listening and be like, well, okay, like, what's your schedule, or like, what do you want to do? Like, you can work on things through the positive obligations rather than through the negative obligations. Like, don't talk to this person. It's like, well, okay, I can sit in a corner. Does that make you happy? It's like, because sometimes someone might be insecure and like they want someone to stay home while they stay home. Like, don't go out because I'm not going out. Because you're going to meet people, and I want you to also not meet people. Like, I'm at home not meeting people, and it's like, well, there the connection between like controlling relationships and like a lack of political cohesion becomes pretty clear, I think. Because it's like, if everyone's at home, we're not going to organize you anything.
That's one that's going to be interesting for us because we have dealt with it more from the long distance perspective. So it's like, yeah, he goes and hangs out with friends, but I'm also not there. So it's really none of my business what he's doing on his own time. We haven't really dealt with what does it look like when he's going out to hang out with friends and I am staying home by myself. And like, it seems like such an easy concept, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to bring up some insecurities or some feeling left out or those things. And I'm going to have to figure out what I need to do for myself in those situations to feel okay while he goes and builds those social connections in a setting where honestly, probably I don't even want to go in the first place, but it brings up some of that stuff for me. And I think that's the other part of it is it's not up to him to fix that, right? Like that's the thing I need to work on and figure out what I need. So maybe I do go plan coffee with a friend the first couple times because I'm not quite ready to stay home by myself or whatever it is. And then in time I can figure out, you know what, now I'm going to eat pizza and watch a movie or I'm going to have some solo fun. So, you know, whatever it might look like.
Because it's, you know, because you can imagine that as him saying like, well, okay, like ideally I would spend this many hours a week with you. And you might be like, well, ideally I'd spend this many hours a week with you. And the numbers are different. And so like, you know, as a very crude first approximation, you can imagine like, okay, well, what happens if you split the difference, right?
Yeah.
But now that might be a really crude, oversimplistic way because it doesn't involve probing into like why people want something, introspection, whatever. It could be that, because actually one thing that came up in the Multiversity Project show, you'll see this at length because you were talking about like someone needing to feel like their partner takes care of them all the time, basically. You know, I actually mentioned that sometimes that insecurity comes from, I think you were talking about testing relationships. One of the things that people test in relationships is whether their partner could be a parent. And I think this is part of why people regress psychologically when they engage sexually, because once you engage sexually, a baby might appear. And so like, here's a preparation. What happens if, let's practice dealing with a baby.
God, I hope not. No.
Let's practice dealing with a baby. Maybe one of us can act like a baby and we'll see. We'll get a preview.
That's really funny.
I honestly believe it's true. I mean, be able to do the studies in 50 years to test this hypothesis, but you know, not exactly you test it, but you know, but of course, you know, another thing that a child needs is parents who aren't testing each other, who are instead helping the child, right? Because, you know, that's just like that's basically like a rough script of how spousal fights, you know, impair someone's childhood. You know, you're like, oh, your parents are fighting instead of attending to your needs. Basically, it's like, you know, and maybe they're fighting to try to figure out how to take care of a baby because they don't know how to yet. They think they can barely take care of each other, and before they, you know. I do think that a relationship probably needs to move out of that phase of like where people are testing each other before you have children, because otherwise,
yeah, we have a cat.
Yes, you haven't learned how to take care of a baby yet. If you can't handle your partner being a baby, you definitely can't handle a real baby being a baby, right?
What is that? Did I just like throw myself right into that by dating someone 5 years younger than me, or like? No, I'm kidding.
No.
It's like crash course, Natalie. Here we go.
No,
I think it did come up though. Honest.
I think it's not so much a matter of someone's actual age. I think people regress, right?
Yeah. I got you. Don't worry.
It's really bad if they regress at the same time.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't go well. Then I would be back in high school. And
it tends to not produce children though. So that's, you know, like relationship. If both people regress, it can be the end of a relationship. I think this is my half-baked theory that I'm spinning here. But like, suppose this is true that people regress when they fuck.
Yeah.
But if they regress at the same time, then the relationship ends because basically none of them was able to get each other out of the baby state.
Right.
So therefore, they're both incapable as parents. Therefore, the sexual relationship should end if you interpret it as instincts that are about reproduction.
That's when you're like, there's no future to this. We're not going anywhere. We're stuck. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, which of course doesn't mean it has to be all about procreation today, because of course you can co-opt and sublimate those instincts into something different, like say political organization. Maybe everyone's horniness could lead to a outcome other than just say like unwanted children, right? Because we have birth control now, but everybody still wants to. Well, everybody. Lots of people still want to fuck more than they do. And that does bring people together and gets them deeper into each other's psychology in a lot of other cases, you know. And maybe that's what we need to understand each other and really work together, is to get much deeper into each other's heads, you know, whether you do that, you know, through one portal or pardon the one avenue, or I mean avenue sounds bad too.
Well, the thing that just came up for me was you said farther like in each other's heads, and then I was like, and beds.
Heads in beds.
Yeah. Head in bed. I don't know.
Anyway. Heads before beds, probably. Connect it mentally before you. I mean.
Yeah.
People are primal; they do the other way.
And then it goes full circle. But no, I find that interesting, and I mean, I don't know if this quite ties from that, but it just reminded me of like even when Hunter and I first got my cat Kristoff, like that was a huge shift in our relationship.
Yeah.
And it's a cat, it's not a kid. But even learning
it's also practiced.
It absolutely was, and it's sufficient practice for me. Thank you very much. But like even learning how to be okay with like, okay, this
who are my
cat.
kids going to do podcasts with?
Sorry?
I said, but who are my kids going to do podcasts with?
Not my children.
With your cat. Your cat talking to my children one day.
People love my cat, and he can't. I'm learning to talk to him, actually. That's a topic for another day. People might think I'm crazy for that, but whatever.
Kids speak cat better than I do.
I speak cat better. Yeah.
No, kids speak cat better than I do, I think.
But you never had cats, did you?
I grew up with dogs. I've gotten to know cats better in this past decade.
Well,
I mean, my grandmother had a cat, but it didn't move around much. It was a very overweight cat, so it was just like, it wasn't really an education in like cat behavior. It didn't have a lot of behavior.
My cat is he has a very strong personality.
You know, I taught a cat to respect my personal boundaries.
Yeah, he does not do that.
You want to know how I taught a cat to respect my personal boundaries?
I'm scared to know.
No, it was very simple, because people think you can't condition cats, which is like a psychological mistake that people make. Because like, I mean, you know about conditioning, it applies to every organism, and like even at the level of the cell, conditioning works. So it's like you can't train a cat the way you train a dog without understanding conditioning as much. You can kind of get by without really like thinking completely in those terms. Although it help with a dog as well for that kind of training. So you know, I teach piano, and I was living. There was a cat living in my house, and it would interrupt piano lessons and things like that. It would just like come and meow at us, and it's like, well, this isn't going to work. So what I developed with the cat is that I would look at it directly in the eyes and go, shh. You know, lots of cues like this. I'm clearly doing something.
Yeah.
And first the cat would be like, "What's your problem? Like, what does that mean?" You know. Yeah. But if I did it 3 times and the cat didn't leave the room, I'd chase the cat out of the room. It's like whatever. Unfortunately, on some level that might be rewarding if it wants attention. But you know, try to do it a little too startling and be like, get out of the room. You know.
Yeah.
And also, when the cat was meowing, I would stop. When I was petting the cat, I would sometimes stop petting when it meowed and say, shh, and then reward it with starting petting again when it would be quiet. Because you need the carrot as well as the stick, right? Otherwise, it's like, why should I negotiate with you? All you do is chase me out of rooms. It's like, no, I also pet you when you're quiet, right? Yeah. And so there's like a positive and a negative side to it.
So what did you say? Like, do I directly apply this to my romantic relationship, or like not so much?
Well, no, because like I was saying earlier, humans can talk. They don't have to test and train each other. They can actually use English. Right now, you might have to go to that level if someone isn't respecting, say, the English language. Right?
I'll pet you when you're quiet.
Well, if you say "don't pet me" and then they do pet you, it's like you have to regress to the punishment level of like, no, bad speech processing. I said, "Don't pet me," you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, this cat knew the number of times. I was always consistent with the 3 times. And so when the cat was in a bad mood, it would still meow twice, but not the 3rd time because he didn't want to get chased out of the room.
That's really funny.
When the cat was feeling cooperative, it would listen the 1st time.
That's interesting. Yeah, I haven't done that. My cat's the kind of cat where like he had pulled chicken out of my garbage can and was eating it. And I went up with my spray bottle and sprayed him like directly in the face with like the stream mode on, and he just looked at me and went back to eating. Yeah, he's like, fuck you, I've been around way longer. I'm gonna do my thing. I'm like, all right.
It's only a punishment in the behavior sense if it changes the behavior.
Yeah, it doesn't work with him. But we're getting better. I've started talking to him more, and I think he understands me, so we're working on it. Yeah. But
so that cat was testing my boundaries.
Yeah.
But it's fair for the cat because the cat, I couldn't explain to the cat in English. Now, if that were a roommate, the fact that I had to, if I had to engage that kind of training with a roommate, I would be right to complain, because you shouldn't have to train a person like a cat. You should be able to just tell them, hey, don't talk to me when I'm teaching a piano lesson or something like that. Or whatever the boundary is, you know, just that is a personal boundary pretty much, when someone's willing to be talked to, when someone's willing to have a conversation. And not everybody learned that growing up. Many people were set a very different example of like parents who would force them to have conversations and they didn't want to, or they'd see a parent forcing another parent to talk when they weren't in the mood to talk. And like, you know, that might be something where there's maybe there's a case made for an occasional exception when somebody's being confronted with something, but I don't think it applies actually to the time. If someone is available for a scheduled conversation, then there's no need to confront them right in the moment about something, unless it's, for some other controlling reason, really. Because, people can bring up stuff that they want to talk about at like a very strategic time, such as when somebody has somebody over at a house. They might be like, oh, now is the time for a fight, because it's actually emotional sabotage. If they time it that they air their grievance right before your friend comes over, so you're in a bad mood for that or something like that. That's emotional sabotage, not legitimate airing grievances. There's no, if the grievance is really that important, then it's might be important to schedule a time to talk about it, where people have time to reflect and they're prepared for it, so they actually address it well. Because if it's not important enough to schedule, then you're just inflating the importance of it to be manipulative, interfering.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes.
Ding, ding, ding.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something that Hunter and I practice a lot more earlier on. And it's something I've been more aware of lately, is when I am not taking that space to process before having the conversation. So like our little kerfuffle last weekend with these charger plates, which I'm very happy about. They're
What's a charger plate?
A charger plate is like the fancy plate that goes under the regular plate.
Okay, so it's not about batteries.
It's
I was like, how many volts are these chargers?
Right? That would be.
Watch over the amps.
It's electric. No, just a plate. They're gold. They're from the dollar store, but they're very pretty. So we're happy.
Put it in the microwave, it'd spark.
This is fact, and I'm not going to test that out, at least not until after the wedding.
After the wedding, that's the honeymoon.
Then sparks will fly.
All the plates in the microwave. That's what they mean about weddings, like babies come from storks and the sparks come from plates.
If a baby came that way, I might be more open to it. I'm kidding. I still don't want babies. But it was that.
You want someone to have babies.
Other people can have them.
You don't believe in voluntary human extinction, do you?
No.
Because people do.
I have
it's probably very dangerous if someone believes in that, because it means they want you to die.
I have some pretty rigid views on procreation in children, but it is not like that. And
in terms of like overpopulation and so on.
Yeah, and people really checking in with their motives in having children,
sure.
And how you need to have the children. This is let's talk about this one another bit. It kind of splitting up like, okay, yes, there's biological impulse. And if you really want to nurture a human being, what other opportunities do you have for human beings that don't have nurturing to begin with? So weighing those out in a way, I think is important. Anyway, for me, I have a cat and soon to be a snake, and I'm good with that. Back to that conversation about plates.
You compare. Well, yeah, I guess we should give this another segment or something. But yeah, you can compare good and bad reasons to want one or more of the children that you raise to be your biological children, because there could be good reasons, there could be bad reasons. Someone might think that they're especially suited to raising their children, and that might be much more true in some cases than others. And so we ask, what is it that makes it true sometimes that a biological parent is a good fit for their child? Because you could imagine some radical view that's like, oh no, the chance of a biological parent being the best parent for the child is like, just random or something. Therefore, society should like source parents for all children and find the ideal. I mean, we know how that doesn't work well in the foster care already, but like, so there must be some connection.
What planet was that?
In foster care are more likely to abuse children. That's why those step parent things in fairy tales.
The Our Danil Oliva series by Asimov. That's one of the things. Like, there's this one planet, and I forget which one it is, but on that planet, like, kids are basically created from like the best genetic combinations, and then they're raised in this other environment away from their parents. Just because of how the society is constructed, and you don't actually have physical contact or connection with people outside of when you procreate. It's very interesting. Anyway,
I wonder if people who went to boarding school would cope better with the kind of separation you were talking about in your relationship.
That would be interesting. Maybe we should interview someone next time.
Yeah.
I have some friends who went to boarding school.
Well, you and I interview someone?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll cross-examine them? Oh my God.
Yeah. Oh, this could be a fun social experiment. No, but my plate story, this was my plate story, was in this instance, I did something that I regretted, but it was actually for the best, was basically I said, no, the way that you acted is problematic. When you're ready to acknowledge that and have a conversation, let me know. But that meant I put the ball in his court, which was like relinquishing that control to an extent. And then I was feeling really uncomfortable because I was like, well, I said that. Now I have to wait. I have to wait for him to be ready.
Well,
talk about it.
You don't have to. You mean you're the one who set the boundary in that case.
Yeah. For me, I was like, okay,
but if you
for
want
myself, I was like, I said this, I need to give that space now and back off. Which meant I had to wait 8 hours, which was really uncomfortable.
That's like a sleep cycle. That's nothing.
Yeah.
Like 2 months or something.
No, it was the same day. However, it was likely an instance where I said that thing thinking it would yield a specific type of response. It was coming from that place of manipulation like you're talking about, and I'll totally call myself on that shit. What ended up happening was he actually respected what I was saying and took it seriously and reconnected with me when he was ready,
right.
Which was for the best. But it reminded me of, and it's something that I've been trying to work on slowly, where when we were first dating, we created a lot more space for that processing time as things would come up. So it would even be like 3 or 4 days before we would schedule a time to sit down and have a face-to-face conversation about something that had brought up unsettling feelings or something less peaceful for either of us. Lately, or in the last year and a bit, it's been a little bit more in the moment, address this now, which in some instances might be necessary. But I do believe, like you're saying, overall, it's really not as constructive. And when we take that time, we're normally better equipped to have the conversation, and we find some sort of resolution, not necessarily that we agree, but some sort of resolution a lot more quickly. Whereas versus if like from last weekend, it's coming from a more emotionally charged, reactive place.
Well, it's funny because I do find myself now wanting to kind of play devil's advocate with my own statement, because, you know, I've been on both sides of this, you know, and you probably have too. A lot of people, I think there's some issues where like it kind of divides people. Like some people have been on this side and the other side. This is one of the things I think most people have been on both sides of this kind of issue of like, sometimes you've been the emotional one and you're like, but I feel like we need to talk now, otherwise you won't hear my raw emotion. And I definitely relate to that as like an improviser, because that's what my whole daily work is making sure that I'm raw and unfiltered and as honest and transparent emotionally as possible. And that's when I improvise the best music. And for a certain kind of interlocutor, that's the best kind of conversation too. Usually it's someone who's like emotionally engaged. Maybe they've done like drama or something, so they can accept a wider range of emotion or something like that. And with those people, if I'm completely unfiltered, they become unfiltered, and we have like very dramatic interactions, but we get somewhere. And like it's not cheap, it's not emotionally cheap, it is draining. It's just like going to the opera for 4 hours or something like that. But it's some people are comfortable with a very full emotional bandwidth. What you might get if you were an actor, or like, drama therapy perhaps, or something like that. Or I feel that way about music. Certainly classical music has this wide emotional range compared to the radio, actually, which is like, it's right in here. Like when you're at the grocery store, it's like, just keep your cart in the aisle, keep your emotions in the aisle. And
that's really funny.
Never mind that it's music that nobody chose to hear, but that's a whole other issue.
Yeah.
Freedom and social choice. But yeah, I really think, I mean, I posted a few weeks ago, stigmatize strong emotion and revolution becomes impossible. So that's kind of the other side of it. But that being said, there's such a thing as being emotionally unhinged and it being completely disproportionate to the issue. And like, I think it also, some people just seek out that drama, not for the issue, but just because they want the extremity for its own sake. And that becomes, I think, less communicative. That's more just like rehearsing technique or something like that than like actually talking about something that's really, something that provokes or merits that kind of passion in a conversation. But I do think that we have a society where we're all kind of emotionally boxed in and just let a narrow range, like, right, I know. And I do think that's part of our docility, that, passivity, submission to the existing political system, which is just like, just go through emotions. And, that might be fine if our system wasn't like chugging along towards like a certain death. So
well, the topic of being dramatic or maybe truthful. No, I'm kidding.
Well, because on the episode with the Multiversity project, I was saying to Chris on that show that like, because he was saying, sometimes it's good for relations to be predictable and people see that predictability and it's like secure attachment and like that's related to like sometimes how often. I was going to say earlier actually. So by the way, you have to be careful in measuring commitment or devotion in like minutes of time. Are
you waving fire at me?
No. You have to be careful about measuring devotion in units of time. Because if somebody thinks that how devoted you are to them is measured in how much time they spend with you, and then you say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I need to be alone for 2 days, then they perceive that as a reduction in devotion, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like you're working together to be devoted to the
Yeah.
principle of like respecting each other's space, in which case you're
Yes.
actually working together. It's the same as like, okay, you go to the grocery store, I'll go to the hardware store. You're apart, but you're working together and getting more done together because you're coordinating your activity.
Apart at the hardware store?
Yeah, as opposed to like, okay, we're gonna go to the grocery store together and then we go to the hardware store together. It's like, well, guess
That's
what?
not efficient.
It's not efficient, is it? And
Thank you.
You might meet somebody else at the hardware store, and they might meet someone else at the grocery store, drugstore.
You know what I think was like the highlight of my relationship so far was when we were trying to plan our day like that, and I had kind of made a plan, and Hunter was like, well, why don't we do X, Y, and then Z, and kind of restructured what I had talked about. And I was like, well, because I want to do this. And he's like, yeah, but it's more efficient this way. And I was like, oh, fuck you. You listened to me. Hey, throwing it back. But I think that definitely relating to that conversation about like spending time alone, etc., brings up what for me is the most important. And I think this is what I was trying to communicate in that conversation that Hunter and I had, was for me, it's more important to spend less time together, but have it be very intentional as opposed to having lots of complacent time.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually plan, because if you're like, just because you live with your partner doesn't mean you shouldn't plan a date, because that's when you're actually, you're going to shower. If you're treat like you would treat any other date. Get ready for your date with your spouse if they're so important. Like have a shower, already be awake. Like be ready to, like, if you're going to leave the house, already be ready to leave the house. Just like if you're showing up for honestly, if you're showing up for work, not that it should be like a job, your relationship, but like you should be prepared to function. Because when people live together, it can get like, oh, I'm passed out on the couch, you're passed out on the couch. This is our relationship. It's like, not really. This is like what you're doing instead of your relationship.
Yeah.
You don't always want we're do what we think is good for us to do with each other.
Yeah. It's like, I think I was talking to somebody about this recently. It's like when you reach that point in a relationship where you're like comfortable farting in front of each other. But you don't always want to be operating at that comfort level.
I think my wife started comfortable farting in front of me, but
you think she did?
I think she was comfortable farting in day one.
Oh, wasn't that sweet?
A great relationship, yeah.
Yeah. Now I kind of wish I could take it back sometimes. No, I'm kidding. But
that's bad for you're not supposed to take your farts back inside of you. It's really bad.
No, it's not healthy.
You'll have to see the doctor.
But like, I guess for me, that's what I kind of relate it to, like half seriously, but also pretty seriously, is like, don't always be operating at that comfort level. Like sometimes it's nice, like you're saying, put intention into it, put on the clothes that make me feel awesome, like go to a restaurant where it's pre-planned, or to a show that we actually had to like plan to buy tickets to, and put that intention into it, because I think like, I deserve that intention as an individual. I make it for myself when I plan to do things
cover your
alone.
mouth when you shoot.
And right. Oh, I can't stand that. And then
pro tip to anybody in the audience.
For each other. Yeah, right. Cover your mouth.
I'm probably guilty of that sometimes.
Don't always fart, but also don't hold them in.
Tell me to cover my mouth.
Do I do that? No, I think I normally have my mouth closed.
Oh, I do a lot of talking when I eat, but I do a lot of this. It's also because I tend to get some of my beard nose. I'm like, you're not going to see this cleanup operation.
Yeah, that's reasonable. My mom
that
just
never
raised
happened.
Me.
Same as it ever was. Yeah.
Just kidding.
It all got in.
But yeah, and I think that's it. It comes down to that, like having that intentional time. And I think through that, if we want to kind of loop all this back together in some way, at least for me, creating that intentional time and knowing that intentional time is being given to me helps me feel more secure when I'm not with my partner, or when they're doing something where I am not their main priority, which is totally understandable and needs to happen. But helps me feel secure through that. And then also gives me that space and freedom where I can start to explore, like, how do I nurture myself in those times? What do I need? What do I enjoy independently or with my friends or whatever? And through that can cultivate a more healthful, honest sort of relationship.
Yeah.
Is that a good summary? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I don't know if we got into the biggest controversy, which is basically like...
Probably not.
Well, because I mean, presumably it's I mean, there's the controversy of polyamory specifically than as opposed to like well, I mean, let me put it this way: which do you find more controversial? The idea that it's better if monogamy comes from introversion rather than control, or the idea that it's better if more people sleep together. Let's start with that idea.
Which is more controversial?
Some people would believe that. They're like, oh, if only people made more love, we'd have more of a loving world. I mean, I understand it's not as simple as that, obviously. But, you know, like I was saying that thread, there was some connection between the peace movement and the free love movement, right? Because, like, what's the opposite of war? Love, you know? It's, yeah.
And so you're asking which is more controversial? Was that a rhetorical question or like a legitimate?
No, I'm literally asking you. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the latter is more controversial.
More controversial. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
a reasonable.
Should we try the easier controversy first, or should we jump to the hard one? I mean,
balls deep first push. I don't know.
Okay, let's do it. So, why shouldn't people have more sex? I mean, surely I'm just going to take up the position. So maybe this is my view, but let's say, why shouldn't people have more sex? Then we'd all be together more, and people would know each other more deeply. All that carnal knowledge, we'd be carnal epistemologists. We'd all understand the depth of each other's soul from all that drama that would happen if we all fucked each other. You know, what's the counter?
As soon as you start talking, not you, like a general you, this is where I like languages other than English, because I could have made that more specific up front. As soon as you start talking anything sex, like everything becomes a fucking innuendo. And we can't handle it. Like we know each other's depths. Yeah, you would.
This is where we're regressing to our old conversational dynamic. Anyway.
Right? It's always fun. And I also really like that part of working with clients on these things. As soon as we start talking about sex, having those little jokes along the way can also make it a more approachable topic of conversation, especially when maybe you just know someone over a computer.
And maybe that's a healthier kind of boundary testing, like testing what's funny, right? Like testing what would be funny to joke about, as opposed to testing by, you know, like for instance, imagine if your partner tested you by joking about tickling you and got the same reaction, was like, well, okay, I want to actually try it then.
Yeah, he learned fast.
Maybe that's maybe there's a separate set of principles for sort of theoretically testing a boundary, because you might test it in your head and be like, I'm going to imagine doing this to somebody and then realize they didn't like that because because I remember they said, you know,
I will slap you really hard.
Remember the words you said, I will slap. And you'll be careful. Some people like that, but that's the thing. It's not every punishment. Like, you know, that the cat might like being chased out of the room sometimes.
He does. My cat actually plays chase like a dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's problematic because you can't really punish him. But anyway, sorry, back to topic of everyone should have lots of sex.
All right. Or should they?
Or should they get to know each other deeply?
I'm actually kind of agnostic in this question, which is why I'm just taking a position. But
yeah, that's reasonable.
So, but are you agnostic about it? Do you think, like, who knows how much sex we should have? Like, I mean, you and I, people in the world, you know, how much should we collectively be having? Should people be fucking more? Should people be fucking less? Can you not say? Is it irreducibly individual and you can't possibly say something at a collective level about it? Or
well, I think there's always that, but for the purposes of moving ahead in a conversation,
there's an element that's irreducibly individual.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like for the purposes of moving forward,
consent, you know, like it's still a choice. So you can choose to be a slut or you can choose to be a prude in terms of like just quantity of promiscuity, let's say, or quantity.
I think in general, people ought to have more sexual exploration now, whether that be with a partner or on their own.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to comment, but I think that at a baseline is important, as people should be, I don't know, whatever, fuck it. People need to be more comfortable exploring sexually, starting with themselves. Because it's like, how do we even communicate if we do go bigger to like, all people should be having more sex with each other? Right. Well, how the fuck do I do that if I don't even know what I like and how to communicate with me in that sense?
And, you know, it brings to mind that whole adage about how, like, you have to love yourself first. And it's funny because people often because people often bring it up and they're like, haha, you know, I don't mean masturbation. And it's like,
but I do.
Maybe you do. Maybe you
really
don't even know that that's what you mean, because, and like the extent of it, like, you know, like you're touching your own shoulders and maybe masturbation, but it's part of getting to know your own body, you know? You know, because I used to really balk at that idea, because I took it a very different way. And it is a way that people do sometimes take it, which is saying you have to have a high opinion of yourself before other people will have a high opinion of you. No. Which it's a little fucked up, because like we get our opinion of ourselves from other people unless we're a complete narcissist, right? It's like what you think of yourself is a function of what other people tell you. If someone tells you you're a good person, you're going to think a little more you're a good person, unless you find a flaw in their reasoning or like you don't trust them or something. If someone tells you you're a bad person, it's the same thing. And you know, that social comparison is part of a healthy way of evaluating yourself. You're not supposed to just love yourself. I love myself. Now I'm ready for a good relationship because I think I'm great. It's like you need to like hate the bad things about yourself and like the bad things you're going to do to your partner, because you will do something bad. in your relationship, and you need to hate that.
Yeah, you'll tickle them
when they said not to. Yeah.
Yeah. Not cool. No, I agree. And I think that what people are really trying to say when they often talk about loving yourself, unfortunately, is not about masturbating more.
It's about the process. Actually, paying attention, like the way you'd have to with a long relationship, giving yourself that 40 minutes a week that your spouse is supposed to need. You know, do you give yourself that 40 minutes a week to talk to yourself, and like all the effort that's involved in the process of loving someone? You have to go in that effort yourself and talk to yourself and listen to your own boundaries and like follow through on your own expectations of yourself and like that loving relationship. But it's nothing to do with having a high opinion of yourself. You know, you don't need to have any opinion of yourself. In fact, you don't need to be judgy. You don't have to say, oh, am I good or bad? People are always like, oh, you'll watch a movie and someone says like, oh, was it good or bad? It's like, what about the content? You know, or like people like the music. Oh, this song was good. This song was bad. This song was better. You know, this person makes more money. This person is better. You know, it's like, people are always doing this comparison, and we don't have to be. You don't have to constantly asking what's better, reducing it. It's the curse of capitalism, right? Because capitalism has this implicit assumption that any two things are comparable. You can put a dollar value, like I would pay more for this than that. And you know, after watching a movie, if someone's like, "How good is it?" Someone's like, "How much is that movie worth?" Like, did we waste our money on that movie? It's like, well, you definitely did if that's the first question you ask.
Yeah. So it's actually funny you say that because you didn't look at my Instagram. And one of the questions that I asked was, do you often describe things in language of good, bad, positive, negative? And edgy. For me, and I like that you touch on the sort of the capitalism part, but for me, that comes from that purity culture upbringing where things are very clearly juxtaposed and put into right and wrong and using that as a rubric for everything. And I've even had that come up with some clients recently where they talk about, well, I like things to be perfect. And I'm like, is it that, or is it that if it's not that certain way, you think you're losing out on this full community because of the rules that they've taught you and how you can fit in?
Perfect how? Like, what's the context of that? Like they want their relationship to be perfect?
Yeah, relationship, or how they present themselves in the world, or it's just that lens of, I need to be this way for this to be right or good. And it's like, well, what if you don't? What if you're in the middle and you explore that area, or how that works for you?
Well, it's funny. I'm starting to realize that your emphasis on let's say the problems of purity culture is very similar to how I like to emphasize the problems of black and white thinking, or splitting, absolutism, whatever you want to call it, false dichotomies. I mean, not all dichotomies are false, and like the thinking. I
love that word, dichotomy.
Yeah.
I
mean, the notion of a false dichotomy or a false dilemma, that's like an untrue disjunction. Like when you say or and it's not or. That's a little easier for people to wrap their head around sometimes, especially in a philosophical concept, the psychologistic thing of black and white thinking and the splitting of someone who has like maybe BPD or something like that in an extreme case. But they're closely related, the logical concept of a false dichotomy and the psychological concept of black and white thinking. Because someone who's black and white thinking is someone who's believing a false dichotomy. But you can discuss more objectively, like, is the dichotomy true or false, if it's like objective words in the dichotomy, like it's like whatever it is, like, you know. But the thinking is it's a little harder to get into the psychology of it. But the purity culture, I mean, let me put it this way. I do think that black and white thinking is something that it's kind of like herd immunity to resist it, because I think some people can kind of slip into a few black and white sentences and be like, oh, okay, I didn't really mean that. And they get back to like speaking in a more measured way. But someone whose mental health is not as good, I think suffers more from the base rate of black and white thinking in society being too high. Oh, I'm glad that makes sense. No, it usually doesn't make sense when I say that to people, but
no, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And it's I mean, look, I mean, a lot of things in terms of like conducting yourself well in discourse about avoiding mental pollution. And guess what? Pollution, that's how pollution is. It doesn't necessarily affect you, because someone can be like, well, I can not make a distinction. I'm fine. It's like, yeah, but you're going to eventually confuse someone else if you speak in these all or nothing terms, you know, because someone else might have a much more direct connection to what they're literally saying and how they feel and act, you know, because some people might like they inflate their language, but what they actually do is more measured and sane, and what is off is just their language. And there might be a lot of people who are like that because they're grounded maybe more by their feelings. Maybe they're not dissociated from their own bodies and emotions or something like that. They're not trapped in the linguistic realm, or maybe that's one way you can be more vulnerable to this. I think there's lots of different ways, but I think it's true of any, like, you know, like it's similar to actually lying to people, that someone might think, oh, yeah, I'll lie here and there, it's justified. I mean, I don't believe that. Certainly not anymore. And it's easiest to make the case for lies of commission. I mean, lies of omission are a little like, you know, you have to tell everyone like everything's in your head, but like, when is silence a lie of omission? That's maybe a hard question, but like,
Yeah.
There's a much more laissez-faire cultural attitude of like, oh, white lies are fine. It's only big lies that matter. It's like, well, if you can't tell the truth and it's easy, you'll fail when it's hard to tell the truth for sure. And it's this mental pollution thing that like, well, just because like it doesn't affect your peer group too negatively that you can tell yet that people tell these small lies. Well, just wait for it to happen, because like someone whose mental health is not good does not cope well with small lies in a lot of cases. If their grip on reality, like suppose it's mental health in the sense that their grip on reality is slipping, right? That's the most basic of it. Is so, well, what happens to someone when you lie to them? Their grip on reality slips a little more, right? And sort of cultural lies that we tell can really impair people whose mental health is slipping, that they fall into believing some cultural lie that's really just a platitude or a nice thing to say, and they're like, oh, but I thought that was true. And,
for me, it was Santa Claus.
Oh yeah, I was so angry about Santa Claus.
Thank you. I was devastated that my family had lied to me my entire life.
Especially it was from the person who taught me not to lie, lied to me.
Yeah, and for me, it absolutely was kind of blown up to that level of like, how am I supposed to ever trust you again if you've been misleading me this whole time?
It's a fair question.
And I was really mad. And so that's where I decided I would never.
Random bullshit.
Yeah.
They could lie to you about the weather, and then you're like, well, what's next?
And that's totally how it felt. And I think also because I was, like, I think I had an okay grasp on reality, but mental health wise or emotional health wise or whatever,
reality, there's the emotional reality too to get
struggling. And, parents go through divorce and things happen, and the culmination of things with that is what like blew it over the top. And it took a lot to be able to trust again. And obviously there's a lot of other factors that came into this. It wasn't just like you lied about Santa Claus and now I trust no one, mind you, maybe a little bit.
You trust no one as much as you did.
Yes, precisely. And I had to learn something I'm still learning. And I think this just comes with continuing to do work on myself and whatever, is learning not to trust people too quickly or how they present themselves to me, because people are at different levels of that sort of self-awareness. And like you're talking about, I think how I'm hearing it to an extent is showing up in an authentic, honest way, like away from those white lies or that image they need to promote or whatever it is, and just actually being themselves, truly, whatever that means in the moment.
Like really talking.
Yeah, and I believe what they're showing me very quickly because I'm used to showing up in the way that I think that they are, if that makes sense. And then I learn a month or two later that actually they're more like this, or they like gossip, or they whatever.
I like gossip when it's good politics, but go on.
Yeah, and then I have to backpedal on the relationship. And so I'm trying to become more aware and take time in that regard to wait till someone else shows up. We'll say authentically, because I think it's a word people can understand. It doesn't necessarily encompass everything I'm talking about.
Does that work, just waiting? I don't know. Does that...
People seem to like that word.
Waiting?
No, authentically.
No, I was asking if waiting works. Like, because I would have thought that it's something
I'm working
actively, on it. I'm probably the sort of person who doesn't consider passive strategies often. I'm always like, what do I do actively for the thing? Which eats away at me when something needs space. Yeah. So I'm like, but what do I do? What do I actively do? I want to do something every day for my goals, And if my goal is the health of a relationship, I want to do something every day about it if I'm worried about it. It's like, no, you have to do nothing for a long time. Like, oh, geez.
I don't have a lot of...
you can work on yourself, of course.
Well, there's that. I don't have a lot of emotional, mental capacity to actively put effort into these newer relationships.
Oh, I see.
So if it's a friend I've known a long time, we're probably way past that point anyway. Chances are the way they showed up initially is the way they continue to show up. And we meet each other in the middle and it's good. Or like, a decade later, we have a conversation like this and I'm like, okay, cool. Like what's next? But for these new people I'm meeting or people at the office, like I'm not going to go out of my way to interact with this person beyond the 9-hour workday or sometimes 12-hour workday. And so it's realizing, Natalie, don't share too much too fast or opt into that sort of a conversation until you've felt through this a little bit more.
You see, it actually depends on things like buyers versus sellers markets to sort of degrade the conversation to a crass economic metaphor, because it's kind of one-dimensional. But anyway, that helps the simplicity of this example, that like you know, suppose one person has a lot of conversation partners, let's say, you know, they talk to 50 people every week, and one person is struggling to find people to talk to, you know, they want to talk to people, they're isolated, they feel lonely, whatever. And maybe they can talk to people, it's not the right kind of conversation or something like that. And, you know, it's, oh, I just gapped. What were we just talking about? I just see, this is how we know we're
people lying.
Oh, well, you know, before I forget, it's probably as I'm trying to remember something else. Before I forget, there's something else in the stack. I was going to say, I like the part that that you said, because it's actually where we could agree on that very controversial question. The part we could agree on is that, like, because like the question of like, should people have more sex? Oh
yeah, that part.
Because you were saying like, well, maybe they should learn about themselves and their bodies and about sex and all that kind of stuff. And that's very much in line with what the motivation would be that I would see behind taking up the position that people should have more sex, is that sex enhances our collective understanding. Yep. That, like, because, you know, well, you know that one of my basic values is collective knowledge, collective understanding. You know, that's why I was in that study room arguing with people at random bullshit, because it's like I want us all to understand shit, you know, and that's what I was there to do, to understand things and so on. And you know, that I actually don't know. Well, there's times when my sex drive is stronger than that drive, but you know, there's other times, you know, there's that Aldous Huxley quote: "An intellectual is someone who found something more interesting than sex." That being said, I think, you know, well, maybe I value sex more than that, but you know, I think that it's a good starting point to come from, which is the value of collective understanding, because also it speaks to the lying question, right? Because like what, you know, I don't think our lives, certainly as humans, are very meaningful individually. You know, we're social creatures. Our lives, we become completely nihilistic in isolation. And a lot of people who are depressed because they aren't caring enough for other people. Because if you just try to find meaning in your own values, it won't happen. Like in the long run, it won't happen. Like you can like examine your preferences and so on, but ultimately you're going to find meaning in your connection with other people. You know, and you know, that's and so like if meaning in life comes from that connection with other people, what kind of connection? Presumably like an honest one. You know, where like, because part of the reason is that you get a collective understanding. And if you value knowledge and like understanding the mysteries of the universe, we're only going to get there together. And some of those mysteries are mysteries about sex and romance and like the metaphysics of love. And you can't solve those mysteries just with pen and paper. You have to actually do it and get the perspectives of the people who are engaged in it and talk to the, you know, your past, present, future lovers if you want to understand love. Yeah. You have to actually do it. Yeah, let's do it. Let's fall in love, as the song goes. You know, it's like, without that, you can't get that collective understanding. Yeah. And now you might say to the question of people should have more sex, it's like, well, if they have more sex without that increased understanding of themselves, it's getting the project backwards, maybe, of collective understanding. That, you know, if the value, or one of the big values of more sex collectively, assuming the birth rate's the same, right? Assuming birth control stays the same, because that's why this is more of a question now, right? Because it used to be directly tied to the birth rate. So how much sex people should have was tied to how many babies should we make. But now
it's just fun.
Well, and other things. I mean, our psychology hasn't changed overnight just because condoms were invented. I mean, you know, people have been pulling out since they've been coming, but you know, it's like, so it's not like birth control never affected our psychology. In fact, it was more psychological birth control, right? It had to be more psychological when it was something like the withdrawal method, or, I mean, they did find like crocodile dung diaphragms that like the Egyptians used. I mean, they also had pyramids on them, so. And
they did some interesting things. That though goes back to the purity culture bullshit too, where like we learned like you don't have sex until you're in love, and it's only to have a baby, right? And so that was
understand each other's bodies.
That psychological birth control, I guess, if you're talking that way. It was like you just don't do it until you're doing it for this specific purpose, and then you owe it to this person because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I guess that's what it was before there was accessible birth control. Yeah, I mean, you know, if I'm going to try to be sympathetic to like the other side of the political spectrum, it's like you could imagine maybe somebody making an argument that like, oh, well, you know, birth rates should be tied to sex rates because otherwise we're failing to use the instincts that we evolved for deciding when a baby should be made. But I don't view it that way at all. I view it as increase, because look, human courtship is more complicated than animal courtship, and as we develop birth control, this adds another step to the process of like creating an even higher bar for a baby to be born. And it's the same with a woman's right to choose. That it's, you know, if we don't have a rape culture, we have a consent culture, then both parents have to agree the baby should exist. I guess that's a higher standard of evidence, but that should create better choices. It's not like we're in danger of having too few children to repopulate the earth at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't think climate change is so bad that humanity won't survive. So I don't think, because you could say like, oh, humanity's in danger of extinction, therefore we should up the birth rate. Right? I mean, I'm surprised how little this comes up in the climate change arguments.
Well, there's people on the other end of the spectrum where they say like the world's going to end, so don't have more children, because why would you bring them into this world?
Well, this is their last chance to exist. They don't have, if their next generation won't even happen, maybe let's make this one twice as big, so there's twice as many people hear twice as much music.
That reminds me
we
of
have twice as many babies.
Sorry, I'm doing my insulin right now. Have you seen the movie Armageddon?
A long time ago, yeah.
So I just always remember that scene of that girl.
Smith.
And she's, yeah, right. And she's like, this is very nuts. There's a girl with a dude. And she's like,
what?
I don't want to die a virgin. Like, that's the scene I always picture, because the world's going to end. And she's like, but I have to have sex before I die. I'm like, yeah, you do. Like,
yeah, I think you do. Take some shrooms while you're at it.
But just, oh God. But it's just, yeah.
Things that people put in their bucket list.
Kind of funny, right? Yeah, that's true. They do. That is not in my.
They're because it's both about experience a different side of reality, right? Like, I don't know. I think before you've had sex, it's like you don't know something about the world, you know. I mean, more than just like not knowing the price of bread around the corner or something. Like, it's like something a deep fact that you don't know about the world.
No, it's definitely true. But I always think of that, and that reminds me of what you're talking about with exactly. It's like learning that new side and feeling part of that thing. And it does, it's just perspective. Yeah.
Speaking of not knowing things from not having sex, the other upcoming episode of the other shows on the Multiversity Project is they're going to be doing an interview with an incel, actually, who apparently is drawing on, Ariel told me, is drawing on Schopenhauer to make some of their arguments.
Interesting.
So I'm going to find out if I pre-refuted their arguments or not, because we addressed it a bit in the episode. I mentioned that there's a lot to address, and you know, I do think because I get in there the idea that like children are entitled to parental love, but adults aren't entitled to sex or romantic love. And there's a transition there. It's again for this growing up thing, right? Of like children might not respect boundaries, but adults are expected to, you know, and children are expected to need supervision all the time, and adults are expected to not need supervision, so they can be doing the supervision, so they can be the supervision, because the watchers, eventually no one, eventually you're it, and it's all on you. That being said, just because people aren't individually entitled to that, it doesn't mean we don't have a collective obligation to have a society which produces lower rates of incelhood. Like, if part of the reason there are a lot of incels is because of poor education in schools, then like, well, it's a no-brainer. Improve education in schools, and if that makes the rate of incels, it's not the same as saying you're entitled to sex, right? It's just a matter of society is entitled to healthy sexuality, and that does involve a certain collective rate of sexuality that can't be too low, you know. And the same thing with introversion in general. And,
yeah. So everyone should just go have some sex right now? I'm kidding.
Well,
but maybe, I mean, that might be on my agenda, but
if it will further your collective understanding of the universe. Not your collective understanding, our collective understanding.
Well, I'm being selfish right now, but
if it's only enhancing one perspective, it might not be the truth.
That's a good one. I think the thing that I often go to, if we're bringing it back into more of like a, you know, less of a broad spectrum theoretical standpoint and more of a in the moment, how can this help a relationship right now? Right. I often share about how I find, at least, that sex can be used, and is really, but can be used as another form of communication. And there will be times in romantic partnership where verbal communication is failing because I really need to step into that physical communication and stop to feel before I can think and articulate, which is counterintuitive a lot of the times to what we are taught, or what I've been taught growing up, which is, you know, if someone's maybe hurt me emotionally or we're disagreeing, I step back, physically step back until we can reach an agreement. Whereas sometimes if it's with a person where I feel comfortable and I'm safe and whatever, opening up that physical communication can actually help the rest of it flow.
And this is such an invisible to a lot of people reason why online conversation relation can be so toxic. There's so many things you got to talk in person, even just to know that they're choosing to not touch you. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like you don't necessarily have to talk in person in order to touch each other. You have to talk in person sometimes to know whether you're touching each other during that sentence. You know what I mean? Like if someone says like, like, oh, I really love you as a friend. And like, you know, it's different if they're like putting their hand on you, you know, like not that,
or
not
if they're like talking over here.
yeah, not that it's not still ambiguous in some way, because I mean, we lack a lot of terms for all those in between levels of relationships, you know, between like, you know, full coital marriage and like loveless friendship or whatever. But you know, it makes such a big difference in the communication and the body language and someone's breathing rate. And people can think, oh, but you know, I'll correct for it. Like, first of all, they don't think that, and when they do think that, they're wrong. And when you actually do put your emotions in words in a text conversation, it's a completely different meaning. Like when you actually say, I feel angry, that means something completely different than just when you answer in kind of a testy way.
Yeah.
But you say that with this anger, it creates a whole different conversation. It doesn't say that you shouldn't be doing it sometimes also in person, verbalizing the thing so you can name it, but you don't always want to go to the verbal level of emotion. I mean, usually it's the other problem that people don't use emotion words, don't use meta emotion phrases like I'm sad that you're angry that Bob is sad or anything like that. But which is what you have to actually do for it to be like a relationship. It's supposed to be like, we need to both be happy. It's like, well, you shouldn't be happy with the wrong things for one thing. You shouldn't be happy about your partner failing on a date or something like that. You know, certainly not happy for their date. If you think your partner's a good person, they're missing out and you're a great partner if they're so great.
Yes.
See, compersion, we didn't even use the word compersion yet.
No, I feel like that could be a whole other topic. Because also,
and artificial scarcity could be
we've been talking like 2 hours. So
I know.
This is going to be 2 episodes, just so you know. I'm going to be breaking it up because this is a lot.
We're about to have an episode.
But we've had 2 already.
Okay. No, I'm making a joke, right? Okay.
I know. I was going to say I'm so dramatic.
How manic is this episode?
That's another conversation.
This episode is so manic that it's 2 episodes.
We're going into episode 3 now. No.
Mental health.
But what was I going to talk about? Oh, you were talking about the thing. I forget. It was important too. Compersion.
I'm just gonna chill for a minute.
Yeah, I don't remember. Probably because my stomach's growling really loud. And
well, you know what? We're both gonna watch this, I'm sure, and we'll remember all the stuff we forgot.
Well,
and
you know what I'm also a bit worried about is I had fiddled trying to get my proper mic to work before we talked, and I realized like 20 minutes ago that Zoom defaulted to my shitty mic. So I'm hoping it still picked up all of the audio. It's just not as good quality. I think it would have if it defaulted. Like it would have told me no mic available if it wasn't working.
It's more work, but I think I have my recording and you can edit them together. On both microphones.
If need be.
Yeah.
I mean, it should be good enough that I can drown out some of the background and like it'll be fine. I hate having all these techie devices sometimes because there's a lot more to track than I have the skill level to do.
Oh, I do remember one thing. So
yes.
Because you were talking about, we are talking about how sometimes you need that physical connection to communicate. And you were saying sometimes the point of sex maybe is communication. And, you know, communicative sexuality is a great ideal, I think. I mean, it is possible to say like, well, you're kink shaming if you say all sexuality should be maximally communicative because maybe some people like particularly uncommunicative sexuality. I mean, I'm not ready to agree immediately with that argument, if you know what I mean, because like it seems very I mean, it's going to create a lot of bad situations in terms of consent if you don't have at least a default very strong preference for sexuality to be very communicative. You know, you might say, oh yeah, there's people who are different and they don't want to talk, they don't want to make eye contact, they don't want to check in. Like, well, I don't know about that. I mean, but there are people who might say they have that preference. So like, what do you do with that? You can't just be like, you're wrong. I mean, you have to say why they're wrong at least.
Yeah.
If they are wrong, maybe they're not wrong. But you know, it is part of why I think sex is good for society is the communicative side of it. I don't think if sex was only uncommunicative, I wouldn't think it was very good for society actually, other than for procreation. I think that it's the same with not lying to each other. It's like that's kind of why talking is useful to compare notes and get a shared perspective on reality. Anyway,
no, totally.
Including something like your feelings about other people, right? Because if you can't tell your partner that you are sexually attracted to a third person, they're not going to understand part of reality. You know, they're just not going to get it. Especially if like one person has way more of a diffuse sex drive than somebody else. They're going to interpret this meaning what it would mean for them if they don't hear enough about someone else's experience and how it's different for them. You know, because for some people, sex and love are very closely tied. So they think if someone's sexually attracted to somebody else, it means it's something romantic, and it might not for somebody else. And blah, blah, blah. But at any rate, I've often thought in terms of communicative bandwidth that like, you know, speech has a certain maximum bandwidth, which is actually part of the argument for anarchism, actually, because you say, well, speech is this limited bandwidth, so you can't actually tell everyone everything you know anyway. So in order to use what you know to improve decisions, you have to be given the freedom to just act without explaining yourself or justifying yourself, which is part of why personal boundaries should be like that, because personal boundaries are the ones, in fact, you can actually use this to address the question of why should certain boundaries be more like personal boundaries. And you might say the personal boundaries are the ones that that person has a whole shit ton of information about that no one else will ever have. Because no one else could ever tell you whether it's right for you to say consent to sex. They're not you. They're not in you. They might be. They're not in your mentally. They're not in you in that moment. So they're not. They don't know your experience. It can't possibly be an informed decision if you're not the one making it. And that's the nature of a personal boundary. I would say that, like, if someone else makes it, the decision is necessarily insufficiently informed. And I think you can make this kind of epistemic argument for a lot of things. And like with the anarchism argument, you can say, well, freedom, you can say you value freedom because you value knowledge. Just like I'm saying you might value sex because you value knowledge, communicative sex. So anyway, there's this limit in the bandwidth of speech, which is part of the argument for anarchism, saying you have to give people autonomy because they can't just do everything in speech and justify everything to an external authority, because otherwise you miss most of the information. And I tend to think of music as having a higher bandwidth than language, is one of the things that attracts me to music. It's also one of the things that attracts me to sexuality, because I tend to think that sex communicates even more than music or speech does. Now, maybe there's exceptions to this, or maybe it inverts for different people, or maybe for some people sex is less communicative and speech is more. I don't really believe that. Music versus sex, maybe that's more of a toss-up. I could believe that some people find good music gives them more of a window into someone's soul than a good lay, let's say. Certainly, if you describe it like that, how soulful is that? So in my inner jury's out on that one, but I know what my personal view is, which like, the inner jury is probably for a future outer jury, but they're standing in and waiting for people's opinions.
Yeah.
But, the people haven't shown up for jury duty in my head yet. That's, maybe these podcasts will help with that, but but yeah, I tend to think of it as I tend to think of beyond procreation. I tend to think of sex as being a good because it can be very communicative, and I tend to think that. Personally, I tend to think that if people were more connected sexually in a healthy, communicative way, that we'd have a society that understood itself much better, especially if it wasn't in the mono context of censoring information about, say, what you think about other people. Because that's just part and parcel of not talking about sex, like not talking about your body, not about your boundaries, not about your preferences, not talking about your preferences for other people. That's another thing you're not talking about. And like, how intimate is your connection if you can't talk about something as intimate as your sex drive, So it's a barrier to intimacy in that way, having that kind of social norm.
The thing, sorry, I remembered one of the things that came up, and talking about like the different levels of communication. But I think the other part of it is we often, and I was actually talking with an old teacher of mine about this recently, and she brought up to pay attention to when I'm having a conversation with a partner or someone, and I use the word "I feel this" as opposed to "I think that," and often we'll use the term "I feel" to prevent someone from being able to argue with us.
This is very good perspective. This person's giving you.
Yeah, and it's interesting to just take note, because like you can't, like you're saying,
your feelings could be wrong.
But like you're saying, if a boundary is based solely in like my experience and and it's a personal boundary, people can't refute it. And like maybe we can also question what it's based in and how you got to that point and how honest that actually is for you based on your experiences and what you're trying to gain from it, and like whatever, we can still look at that and explore it. But I also think that when we use the word "I feel" or the phrase "I feel," if we're using it in that way, it really can be taking us away from feeling, and it's more like I'm thinking this, or it shuts down conversation, and it like, how do I explain? I always try to bring back emotions, like a label of an emotion, to an actual physical feeling.
Yeah, because you don't need to say feel or think. You can just express a thought or a feeling. You can say like, "That's false, I'm angry," right? You might say, "I think that's false, I feel angry."
But and so how do we actually feel? Like, but if you physically.
But suppose, compare that to say, "I feel that's false and I think that should make me angry," or I think
I feel angry and
No, I'm trying to say, what if you do the mismatch and you use the think for the emotion term, right? Because this is almost like a linguistic experiment, right? So like, because you can measure people's response time to these sentences. Do they seem grammatical, right? Because you could say, "I think that's false, I feel angry," or you could say, "I feel that that's false, I think I should be angry," or something like that, right? Or I think I'm angry. That's a different claim, but they're both think, like, thought, Or you could say, I think angrily about it. That's different, right?
Yes,
I think,
that's.
in fact, maybe I should say this more often, but I might,
I think angrily.
people might understandably be better if I said, I think angrily that that's false. Because, when something's false, I know it's going to harm somebody. So that makes me angry.
Now I'm just thinking of all the Elise that I can do. And I think now I'm going to be way too aware of it, but I'll just talk. Even saying I feel angry versus I am angry, there's two parts to it. I think on one, it can take away from my ownership of that feeling. So it's a way to distance myself and distance you, in that it really can't be questioned. Whereas I am this, it really kind of forces me to step into that space.
So here's a brain twister for you.
Oh.
Actually, maybe I did tell you this 2 years ago, this sentence. The feeling that feeling a feeling is wrong is wrong is wrong.
Oh, sweet Jesus.
I'll parse it differently. I'll paste the puzzle version of it. But like,
we'll write that down.
Some people think that a feeling is wrong. Like, suppose you have a feeling and I say your feelings are wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, someone might say it's wrong for me to feel that because I'm feeling it about a feeling. That your feelings can't be wrong. So someone else might feel that I'm wrong to feel that your feelings are wrong. I would say that third person is wrong. If their reason for feeling that is just that I have a feeling about a feeling, that it's wrong. Because what if what you feel is happiness at the death of a child or something like that, something horrible, right? And I could say that's wrong. You're not supposed to be happy that child died.
Yeah.
And someone might say, hold on now, all feelings are valid. And I
still can't. Correct. I can't deal with that use of the word valid.
Nor should you have to. No one should have to. It's bullshit.
Thank you. Someone at my work did that the other day. He was like, that's a valid point. And I was like, well, actually, you should know a point is not valid. It is true or false. And and an argument can be valid. And then
a phrase I do like is I can see where you're coming from, but don't say if it's not true. If you can't say I can't see where you're coming from, in both cases you're helping,
I like it and I don't, because when someone comes to me and says, I understand why you would think that. So you don't agree with me?
You seem
all right.
I mean, if somebody as dumb as you would think that.
All right, Mr. Nice Guy. No, but the next part of what I was getting at too was that we articulate a feeling in words as opposed to actually physically feeling it. And so I think that sex can be a more explicit form of communication, which I feel is to some extent what you were, different use of the word. I like that.
Actually, I think it's a related use of the word. I've thought of this before. Yeah. I didn't actually look up the etymology though, but you see what I mean? That don't be explicit. So don't have sex and also never say what you mean.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a great life.
Mean what you say. Yeah. One thing leads to another. So
I heard someone actually say once, they were giving advice to somebody saying, don't ever tell them exactly what you want.
Oh, I've heard that too. Okay.
Yeah, so
wait, I need to think this thought through first. Is that, because I haven't finished this thought yet. You've interrupted me like 3 times. I think too slow. It's okay. Sex forces us to actually just show up for physical sensation. And I think that's especially good sex. There is the sex, good or not good or bad, but for me, the more pleasurable sex comes when I am fully in it physically, not thinking about it, not trying to get to a certain point of experience, physical or otherwise. And yes, there might be words in communication during, but it's with intention of experiencing physically. And when we're in a place of talking about feeling, we're taking ourselves away from actually experiencing the sensation of it. And so in those times when we're so wrapped up in a conversation with a partner about a thing, sometimes we need to actually let ourselves show up for the thing. And I'm not saying have sex to physically feel anger, if that's what you were trying to express, but just have sex to allow yourself to physically feel something as opposed to talking about it.
Yeah. I mean,
that makes sense.
I'm inclined to remember the occasion where I told a partner not to ask me how my food was while I eat it.
Well, that makes sense because that's the wrong tense.
No, it's like, are you enjoying it right now? Like,
Oh,
is
okay.
your
I was like, oh,
I mean,
yeah.
this is a habit she picked up from her mother, who was like making the food and thus asking about
Oh,
like, should it be different or whatever. And like, and
mm,
my mother was just like,
interesting.
just fucking eat it at any rate. And
Yeah.
like, I mean, we might talk about it later, but like, well, but that's besides the point, really.
Yeah.
That's just the genealogy of it. I mean, what
Yeah.
I'm getting at is that like, if you're eating food and you're like having
Hmm.
food thoughts, and then suddenly you're having word thoughts, it takes you away from the food thoughts.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. And so we need to just fuck and not have fuck thoughts all the time.
Yeah. Especially
Yeah.
if someone, in the case of the food, if someone's sort of anxious, like, is the food all right? Is it all right? It's like, oh, geez, I felt relaxed until you're all worried where the food
Was it good for you? Did you enjoy
Yeah,
it?
I mean, I guess this is related. You know,
Sorry.
okay, so here's an example. Here, I'm going to let you feel this example. So someone told me
Okay.
once, speaking of like, checking in and boundaries and consent culture, I knew someone once who said that, they were hanging with this guy, they were kind of into him, like things were kind of going well,
Hmm.
until the moment that he asked if he could kiss her. And she said that until that moment, she wanted him to kiss her. Until he
Huh.
asked, and it altered her desire. The very act of asking changed it,
Interesting.
to say the least. So, like, how would you counsel such a person or their partner or
Well,
their date?
so I think there's like is the word systemic reason that is the case,
Right.
where often I think women in particular, that's all I can really speak for because I am that,
You know me pretty
internalize
well.
that narrative of,
I give you authority to speak for men. I'll tell you if you get it
oh,
wrong.
thank you. Well, I mean, I think it does show up more for women and men on the flip side. Like women are taught to show up a certain way to help elicit a certain response. And it's not in the traditional upbringing that these things are explicitly communicated. It's like, oh, if I show up for the date and, he might hold my hand, or if I lean in at the end of the night, will he kiss me? I think, and that's what we grow up with. That's what I grew up with. And so getting to a point where I guess the first step is that other person actually explicitly asks versus just doing. And I have not had to opt in that explicit way before. It's always been more of an implied passive interaction. And so it can get super uncomfortable because when have I ever shown up for my desire in that like open of a way? I haven't.
Well, it could be very different communication styles.
Yeah.
Right. Because it could be that this person expects someone to be able to read them well enough that they
Mm-hmm.
know when they want to be kissed, so that
Mm-hmm.
they can also read them well enough for what comes after the kiss, for that not to be too negotiated,
Yeah.
let's say verbally. Maybe they don't want it to be
Mm-hmm.
too verbal.
Yeah.
But you could say the flip side, like, well, maybe this person is just too uncomfortable with verbalization. Maybe that's unrealistic, that like
And
there's a
that's
certain
what I would look
baseline
at first.
communication. Yeah.
Can we be comfortable exploring it more in that verbal way and sharing that openly, and then in time perhaps get to know each other where it becomes a bit more implicit and we kind of navigate each other that way and that sort of thing. But I think that showing up for it more explicitly with that verbal, like acknowledging what is happening, really does challenge like how rooted in my desire am I, and how much do I feel that I deserve to have that desire fulfilled as a woman in this interaction. And so I think that would be the first thing that I would look at. And that's what I've looked at for myself in moments where, I have a desire romantically and I'm like waiting for my partner to fulfill it versus just articulating it.
Yeah.
Right. And like, yeah, maybe sometimes we'll be able to read into it and it just kind of flows or whatever.
Yeah. And there are
Other
things that it's
times
acceptable to guess about.
I might need to explicitly ask, and they might also explicitly say no. That's the other part. And I think that's the next part is when it's asked, or when I'm asking, can I be okay with the fact that that other person might not consent? Right? Like just because I've expressed my desire doesn't mean they're going to be okay with fulfilling it. And then what do I do? And then on the flip side, if that person's asking, they're expressing a desire, what does it mean if I say no? Like, am I letting them down? Am I doing something wrong? And that brings up that whole other side of things to process.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found I remember a conversation I had with my mother a long time ago when I was a teenager, in terms of being okay with people saying no, because I remember at a certain point saying to my mother, like, okay, well, you should start like asking me to do things rather than telling me to do things. Like I'm like kind of becoming an adult now, like, like often enough, like there's probably things that I would be happy to do, maybe not every time, but like if it's the right time, if someone asks, like, help is needed with doing this. Like, okay, sure. But the moment someone's telling me to do it, I immediately get back. I'm like, well, fuck you, like, because then you're supporting something else, which is the notion that you can be told to do it, which is different from the notion that like you want to help or that like something needs doing. So my mother started asking me, and then my mother had anger problems, getting very angry if I said no. And I kept telling her, like, just because you're saying please doesn't mean you're asking. I only find out if you're asking when I know how you react to no.
Right.
Yeah. And now, I mean, this is something that parents are supposed to teach their children, not the other way around. But anyway, our culture has learned this slowly, I guess. We're developing more of a consent culture.
Yeah.
And, she'd had a lot of bad examples of how people had treated her.
Yeah, it's like I asked nicely, so can you just do it?
That's not very nice.
I don't owe you anything just because you asked politely. Like,
yeah. Well, the other thing with personal boundaries is that, like, you're supposed to respect them regardless of how nicely somebody asks. And it can be a good test that if you want to find out if somebody really respects your boundaries, ask as unnicely as possible. And if they still respect them, then you're golden. If you have to ask nice,
I get what you're saying. You have to ask nicely for them to respect it.
The way I put it before, it doesn't say that once you know they respect your boundaries, you don't then want to ask nice. But like one of the way I put it before is that tone dependent respect of personal boundaries is not respect of personal boundaries. It can't be tone dependent in any way. And you can test if someone's respecting you in a tone dependent way by varying your tone. I mean, it could be the flip side. Imagine if they only they only listen if you say it angrily, and they don't listen if you ask nicely, or vice versa. Either case could be an issue, because they're supposed to ask in a way that's completely independent of the tone. Because it's not up to them or to decide that your tone is inappropriate for them to respect your personal boundaries, because the whole idea of a personal boundary is that you have complete authority over it.
Yeah, those need to be separate conversations. Like I remember you sharing before, and this really stuck with me, is like focus on what someone says, not how they said it. And I think in terms of a boundary being communicated, at least, like that is it. It's like
in that case, it's right.
It shouldn't matter how I say it. It is what I said. Respect it. And we can potentially talk about, if it's warranted, how I articulated it at a later point as like a separate line of conversation, but you respecting the boundary should not be contingent on that.
Yeah. And actually, one thing that I find is tricky is figuring out when there should be that, what I would call a tone partition, between tone and content. Because I mean, the tone's telling you something else, but maybe what that tone is telling you in those cases that this person is testing whether it's tone dependent.
Yeah.
Right. Because it could be, what the tone is telling you could be on the meta level, right? Some of these people miss the meta level and think like, oh, what their angry tone is just saying that they don't like me. It's like, no, their angry tone is saying that they want to feel that they respect your boundaries independent of their tone. This is why they're trying both tones. Yeah.
No, totally.
Yeah.
Meta is better.
Totally.
I'm using that too. Yeah. God. We need to publish that pattern. Do you still remember your pattern song?
Oh my God. Yeah, you asked me about that. It'll come back to me one day.
It was just, do you care about the patterns?
Yeah, but there was but I forgot some of the notes, and there was like
there were particular notes because I think it was a pattern.
There was also more in my head than I was singing in the office in the middle of the night.
I remember that as well.
You remember it was in my head? Jeez, get over there.
No, I remember you, I think, alluding to the fact that there was more, or you'd drift off and I'd stop paying attention. But, I was trying to write a paper. So, yeah. But, I feel, not that I want to cut our conversation.
Yeah, no, I think we're about tapped.
I think we did some good talking. I need to hydrate.
I need to go listen to this conversation and see what I got wrong.
I'm hoping I record it. Well, it's ever evolving. We can do another one separately.
Oh, I know, but what I mean is that's how I evolve my views. I always check. I try to anything that I type or say publicly, I'll go over repeatedly to make sure that I still believe it.
Yeah. Do you have any parting words that you feel are necessary? Do you feel like we've conveyed what we needed to talk about?
Crave each other's freedom.
I like that. I could title it that.
Okay.
Yeah. I am going to go communicate with my partner. So
sounds very educational.
Yeah, hopefully. Maybe we'll learn a couple things. But yeah, thank you. This was awesome.
I guess I'll just say, if anybody sees this and thinks I'm wrong, please tell me.
Yeah, so you're good at that. I get defensive, but no, I need to learn.
If you think Natalie's wrong, tell me.
Yeah, right. And then we'll talk about it another day.
I'll tell her, yeah.
Yeah, you've known me long enough to know how to deliver a thought to me.
Listen, the public is not happy with your remarks.
You know how to say the what to get me to engage in the way that I need to for my own growth. But yeah, thank you. This has been awesome. We covered many topics, not necessarily what I thought we would, but I think breadth and depth that will help people think about these things in a little bit of a different way.
Oh, and one hanging thread, maybe you'll edit this back in earlier, but on the tone precision thing, an easy example is like, not just the personal boundary case where like it should be tone independent. It's something that people also test in something like a math class. Because if you say what's 2 + 2 versus what's 2 + 2, mathematically it's the same question. Now you might be sending a different message, and this is part of the problem with math anxiety and math education and this sort of thing. But and different people respond differently to completely different emotions. But definitely the answer is supposed to be independent of the tone, and like you're not graded. You don't get grades for answering the question wrong when it's asked angrily. I mean, maybe that would be an interesting way of grading the teacher, I guess. But and in fact, remember I was talking about the cat when it didn't feel cooperative. There was a parrot who, Alex the gray parrot who's died now, who could do some simple counting of different things. So it'd be like how many green. It would say how many green objects were and how many yellow and so on. And the thing is that Alex would give the wrong answer when he felt uncooperative, when he wasn't happy with something else. And that happens with kids in math lessons, piano lessons, where it's like when I started teaching piano to younger kids, I started to pick up on when they give the wrong answer deliberately. And actually taking the middle of them and be like, well, the problem with that answer isn't that it's wrong, it's that it's wrong deliberately.
Right.
And I remember seeing the look in some kids' eyes and they realized like, oh shit, he knows that I gave the wrong answer. Like, yeah, because I know you know this. You know,
I've been no.
So maybe you could make the counter and say there are cases in which a math class should be very tone dependent, and maybe that's the math anxiety. But I would say that you would say that as a preparatory stage that your goal should still be able to answer math questions in a tone independent way. And it's the same with respecting someone's boundaries. Maybe when you're a small child, you need to not be like screamed at for violating someone's boundaries because you don't know anything yet. But by the time you're an adult and you're expected to know, that is a legitimate response. And being like, fuck you, you should know this. Like I already said, leave me alone. Yeah. Anyway, speaking of leave me alone, internet. We're going to go offline.
We're done. It's time. Thank you.
Okay, just pause the recording for a second.
Yeah, I did.